Hey, this is Cam with Blacktail Studio, and I am primarily a woodworker because I believe that I am not creative enough to come up with anything that could come close to rivaling what already occurs in nature as it is. And that got me thinking, and I went through and thought about the hundreds of projects I've built and went through all the videos that I've made and picked the handful of different wood species that I believe stand apart and stand on their own. I have a old growth redwood slab, wood that you can't even cut down anymore. I have a myrtle wood project. Myrtle wood only grows wild a few places in the world. I have my personal favorite, a multi-table project out of Bastogne, Walnut, and more. This video is over 2 hours long, uninterrupted woodworking. I hope you enjoy it. This build started about 5 months ago, and I don't know that I actually have any hardcore fans, but if I do, some of you might recognize this footage and this crate from the ebonized Mappa Burl table that I built just a couple of videos ago. And the reason this crate was so big and the reason this crate was delivered to my wife's work instead of my shop is because of this massive old growth redwood slab, which is what we're working on here. And both this redwood slab and the Mappa Burl came from a company in Southern California called GL Veneer. And one of the things I love about GL is, unlike my local suppliers that deal mostly with local woods, GL has slabs from all over the world, although this old growth redwood slab did come from California. I almost exclusively work with hardwoods like walnut and maple, and if you're not a woodworker, you might assume that working with softwoods would be easier than working with hardwoods because it's easier to cut, it's lighter to move around, things like that. And while that is true, everything else is more difficult, including this live edge cleanup, because I was afraid if I used some of my normal aggressive tools, I could really damage this extra soft redwood. And so I reached out to the guys at Pure Space Dry Ice Blasting, and they use tiny dry ice pellets. And this is primarily used for like fire damage cleanup, where they can blast away all the charcoal and leave the solid wood. So I used them to help clean up this redwood, which has a very soft edge, and hopefully just leave the perfect remaining live edge. I make a lot of jokes on this channel, and usually I have a pretty good idea when that joke isn't going to go over super well with certain demographics. However, I don't think I have ever underestimated a group more than I underestimated the passion behind the anti-circumcision group when I made a joke last week comparing the cut edge versus a live edge. I can tell you an edge that's cut is going to be much easier to clean. Some would say more hygienic, and in my experience, women actually prefer it this way as well. In that video, I had joked that some of the people that felt so much passion for live edge furniture and live edge humans, they could border on fanatics. And after the hundreds of comments, countless emails, and guy who signed me up for a consultation with one of the doctors from doctorsagainstcircumcision.com, I can now see that they are not fanatics. I think that you guys are just doing the Lord's work, the non-Jewish Lord's work anyway, and you guys are just more of a man than me. And I mean that quite literally. You have slightly more man parts than I do. So I want to thank everybody, and because of that, I am no longer taking the live edge off any tables. I am in fact reproducing the live edge on some parts of this table that were disgracingly cut, and I might even look into reproducing my own live edge. Just please, please don't firebomb my house. All right, now that we got that unpleasantness out of the way, let's move on to a less controversial topic and something I think that all of us can agree on, and that is using old growth trees for decoration and furniture in wealthy people's houses. I don't know, do you think that segue is going to get me canceled or not? But this is something that I want to talk about because there's a lot of misconception about working with these big old growth slabs. And first off, you can't cut old growth trees down now. People think that they just go level the redwood old growth trees now and make it all into paper, and that's not the case. You can't even cut down one of these trees. They're all protected now. Back in the day, they did. They just destroyed these forests in horrible, shameful ways, and there is no satire in that. I genuinely think that was a horrible thing that they did. This tree had been sitting, or this stump I should say, had been sitting for something like 50 to 100 years from back in those logging days. And back in the day, they didn't want the really pretty figured wood. They wanted dimensional lumber to build houses. And so all of this crazy grain, this wild grain, the really pretty stuff, they just left it. And because it's so big, it didn't really rot. And this company, GL Veneer, they come through now and they salvage it, enable it to be turned into something amazing. And Some people still might not like that, and I think that they're completely entitled to that. However, I think it's pretty cool to be able to use this. It reduces the fire load in these forests because they are just laying dead on the forest floor. So that is how I got to use this amazing old growth redwood slab. And just know you can't cut an old growth redwood tree down today. One of the very difficult parts about working with this particular slab is just how freaking big it was. It was about 7 feet wide by about 7 feet tall, and the biggest CNC that I could find in my town was only 6 feet. And so what we had to do, which was almost kind of fortunate, is you might have noticed that tip of this slab was actually broken off. There's a chainsaw mark that I'll point out here in a little bit, and it was just under 72 inches or 6 feet with that tip removed. So what we did is we took a couple passes. We did a little bit of flattening on the top, flipped it over, did some flattening on the bottom, and then came back and finished flattening the one top, and then we added that top. There's the tip of it right there, and that way we can hopefully get all of the thickness pretty uniform. But again, just had to be creative. That was my friend Jordan Guy, who's really good on the CNC. Got it worked up for me, and now I got it back home, and now the next thing I need to do is attach that top and really get started sanding this thing. The person who this slab is for, who, by the way, ended up being my favorite client I've ever worked with, decided to maximize the thickness of this redwood slab, which is why you see it wasn't completely surfaced on the backside. And in order to get the backside as flat as the front, would have had to lose about a ½ an inch or so of thickness, and they decided that it was going to be better and really a lot cooler looking if they could maximize the thickness of the entire piece. So just had to rough sand that with 80 grit. And one thing about the softwood, it does sand really, really easily. So that was a lot nicer than sanding something like white oak. Earlier I mentioned the chainsaw miscut in the slab, which is what caused this tip to break off in the first place. And that's that piece just to the left there, that straight line. And I decided I didn't want to hide it. I didn't want to try to fill it with other wood or fill it with epoxy. It's part of the history of the slab, and while it doesn't look amazing, again, it's just part of the history, and I think it's pretty cool. So what I did is I just lightly epoxied on that tip, so then I could go attach it a little bit more securely. Despite our best efforts with the CNC, you can tell we didn't get that tip just perfectly level with the rest of the slab. So I had to break out a tool I don't really like. This is my old Makita hand planer, and it removes a lot of material. It just is a little bit messy, and I wouldn't say that I am the most proficient with it, but got the bulk of it removed and then used the belt sander, which can be a pretty good tool for keeping things nice and level. Got a perfect straight edge there, and now this enables me to introduce you to my very first ever product. People are always asking me, why don't I find a faster way to do my bow ties? Why don't I use a CNC, or why don't I make a jig? And first off, one is I don't have a CNC, two, I don't have room for a CNC, and three, I wouldn't know how to use a CNC even if I got one. And as far as the jig, there are other bow tie jigs out there, but they all make just kind of ugly bow ties. They make kind of a square blocky one with a rounded corner, and that is the inherent problem with any of these bow tie jigs, is you have a round bit, so it's going to have a round corner. And so I wanted to come up with a design that really highlighted that round. So I made this one with a round back. And one of the things I really like about this one is using different bushings, you can make different size bow ties. And this cuts the bow tie and the inlay itself. And I'll show you how to do this. I'll probably have a separate, more detailed video on exactly how to do it. But this is the biggest bow tie that the jig will make. And these ones are just structural. These are going to be what holds that top on the back. And there's the look. I would love to get some feedback from you guys. I want to know if you like this design, if you don't like that rounded back, if you do like it. If you stay tuned in the video, I'll show you a smaller, a little bit sleeker bow tie that you can make with the very same jig though. What I think the majority of you guys will appreciate most about this bow tie jig is just how few tools you need to make essentially perfect inlays. All I'm using here is my router, and no, you don't need a $600 Festool router. Almost any router can accept these bushings. You need that inlay kit, which I got the one from Whiteside, and then just the blacktail bow tie jig. And with very little practice, you can make essentially perfect inlays. And I've seen some really, really bad bow tie inlays out there, even at like actual furniture shops. So don't feel bad if you aren't great at hand cutting them. And no, I'm not done hand cutting my own bow ties. This is just an additional option, because cutting a rounded back one like this would be extremely difficult freehanded, and also doing inlays in redwood or softwoods is extremely difficult. So this is just another tool for my toolbox, and we're doing an extremely limited run of these. So if you're interested, they are for sale now. There's a link in the video description. I hope you'll check it out and give me some feedback about how you like using this black-tailed bow tie jig. As I was developing this over the last couple months, I got a lot of practice using this jig, and I learned there's some pretty neat little tricks you can do. Like, you can actually control just how tight each bow tie fits in there when you're cutting that negative. If you want a little bit looser fit like this one was, you can make several passes with the router. And if you want a very, very snug fit, you can make just a single pass. And no matter which one I'm doing, I usually prefer to add some of the redwood dust or whatever dust of the wood that I'm working with. And that will just potentially fill any tiny little micro gaps. Although when you're doing a jig like this, it's really not that necessary. And this isn't my favorite design of the jig. I'll show you my favorite design here next. Those ones were essentially just structural, but I have some incredible wood for the next one. This is from Matt's Woodworks. He built this $60,000 table, and these were some offcuts from a 1,500-year-old redwood root. And this thing is crazy. It is incredibly hard. It's like as hard as ebony, and this redwood is about as soft, or it's softer than Doug fir. And this is the other design that I have. This is where you can add a different size bushing and make a slightly smaller, a little bit sleeker, more modern bow tie. Personally, I like the look of this bow tie much, much more than that first bow tie that I showed you. It's a little bit sleeker. You actually get those sharp corners on it. It's just a much cooler design in my opinion. I would actually put this in like my personal dining table. And if it wasn't clear how I did this, instead of the white side inlay kit, I just used a 3/8 inch brass bushing, just one that most woodworkers probably have laying around. And now to cut the recess, I'm going to use a 5/8 inch. And the important thing to know is as long as you increase by 1/4 inch from the one you use to cut your bow tie to the one you use to cut your slot, it will fit every time. And that's why you can get a bunch of different sizes out of this same bow tie jig. And again, this is the design that I like. I like the little bit more modern, a little bit sharper corners, and there is one additional step that you have to take if you want to do this one with the 3/8 inch bushing that gives you a little bit sharper corners. And I'll show you that right here. It looks cool, but that router still cuts a slight radius, so you just have to use any old chisel and just make it a little bit sharper, and you don't have to take off much. You can see it's just bringing it to a point and cutting it down. So there is a tiny bit more work to do these a little bit more modern bow ties. I think it's worth it, but in the end, it's totally up to you and why there's so much flexibility with this bow tie jig. It's probably worth mentioning that anytime you're doing a structural inlay, pretty much the worst wood you can use are the ones with the swirling kind of burl grains, a lot like the ones I'm using here. And the first problem, which isn't the main issue, is that they kind of chip out. I was trying to use the hand plane here and it chipped out, luckily above the surface, so I was able to use the belt sander to get it flattened out. But really, they're more prone to breaking. You want the really nice straight grain stuff, and these ones are going to be mostly just for looks. I have the bow ties on the back, and that's going to provide all the strength, but these ones do look pretty cool. So I have very little experience finishing redwood, and since this is kind of a once in a lifetime piece that I'll probably never have access to again, I was extremely paranoid about messing it up. So over the last several months, I have frantically been trying all kinds of different finishes on different samples of redwood. Some of them have been pretty cool. This is shellac. It's not quite right for my shop and my setup. This other one was actually shellac, but it was a little bit bland. It made me kind of paranoid about trying more shellac. But what I eventually landed on is applying an epoxy base coat, sanding it off, and then applying the finish, which we're going to use a hard wax oil, gave a ton more depth and color to the piece, opposed to here where there's no epoxy base coat and it really looks kind of muted and bland. So what we have to do is put a epoxy base coat down, sand it all off, and then apply our finish to really highlight the character and depth of this redwood. Before we get into the rather extended and meticulous process of finishing the top, which is going to take a couple weeks, I'll show you how I finished this underside in about 15 minutes. And this product is called Seal-A-Cell, and it's not a particularly beautiful finish, but what it does really well is it seals everything up. You basically just saturate it, let that wood absorb as much as it possibly can, and then you're done. This whole YouTube journey has just been an absolute whirlwind for me. When I started this, I genuinely never expected to have any significant amount of subscribers, let alone something like the option for sponsors. And the sponsors are something I've been giving a lot of thought to lately. I started to wonder if it's worth a certain amount of dollars for a company to put their product in my video. Why wouldn't it be worth it for me to bet on myself and put my own product in my own video? It's even more on brand than any company I could work with. And one of those products that my viewers have been having a ton of success with is my epoxy table workshop. It's like a 3.5 hour long masterclass on how to build a wood and epoxy table in your home, shop, or garage. As one of my viewers said, he was really glad I didn't just repurpose a bunch of YouTube videos. It's all original content. It's something I'm really proud of, and if you want to check it out, there's a link in the description. After I got that top sealed with epoxy, I was ready to start working on sealing this live edge, which was kind of challenging because I didn't want to build any sheen on it. So I didn't want to put any epoxy on this live edge. So I used that same Seal-A-Cell because it's going to seal it up really well, harden it up, and not really build up any type of sheen. I absolutely labored over the decision over how to mount this because I was really afraid of getting a glare from the ceiling lights and wanted to be able to tilt it forward. So the best idea that I could come up with was, yes, using a big TV mount. And no, I do not know if this is going to work. And one thing you know about me is I will always show my mistakes. So I'm going to finish the top, and then we're actually going to use a TV mount to mount this massive redwood slab to the wall. So see how that goes. Of all the aspects of this build, the sanding was unquestionably the most difficult. And I don't mean that it was physically difficult to remove material because this redwood is so soft. That part was actually really easy. What was difficult is keeping it perfectly flat, because when you have these really, really soft woods with all this crazy wood figuring, you have a lot of different wood densities. And so if you leave your sander in any one spot for just a microsecond too long, you start getting these little peaks and valleys. We'll remove that softer wood and leave the harder wood and can really compromise the finish. So I took my time. I won't say that I'm the redwood expert at this point, but I feel a little bit better going into my next redwood project if there is one. And what I did was I sanded from, I believe I started at 80 grit and I sanded it up to 500 grit, which is much higher than I normally go, but it's going to give it an amazing sheen that really looks more like polished stone than kind of a typical wood finish. The finish I'm going to be using is called Osmo 3043, and it's listed as a satin finish, but we're going to build that sheen up way, way past satin. You can actually go to pretty much a high gloss with it, and this finish might be the prettiest finish I've ever used, and I've used a lot of different finishes, and I will say the protection on it is fine, so long as you don't look in the general direction of it, and certainly never place an object on this. And just to be clear, I am saying, yes, this finish is horrible protection. Never use it on a table. It's actually marketed as a hardwood floor finish, which I think is comical, but yeah, I think it's absolutely beautiful. I don't have an axe to grind with the Osmo people. They're nice people, but it's just not a good, durable finish. So use it only for decorative things like these wall pieces. The way I apply Osmo and the way I learned to apply Osmo is you basically buff it in with that white pad and you just leave a little bit on there. And here's what remained the next day, which I wasn't too surprised at. Certain areas absorbed more, other areas absorbed less. And now I was going to come back with this 600 grit sand lightly and start building the coats from here. And I am going to give you the abbreviated version because I ended up probably doing about 5 or 6 different coats on this piece, sanding in between of most of them, but not all of them. Osmo you can actually apply without sanding in between coats if you want to, and this was just kind of a lengthy process to get that sheen as even as I could. I do really like this 600 grit Abranet, whatever it is from Mirka. It sands the Osmo really, really nicely. And here is just that second coat, goes on really easy, and unlike something like the Rubio that I use where you remove all of it, this stuff you need to leave a little bit of it on there, and after it kind of dries overnight, I have another tip that you'll come back and I'll show you that final step to getting a really, really even sheen with the Osmo, and that's this here. This is the liquid wax cleaner, and you just splash a little bit on there about 24 hours or so after putting on that last coat, and that will really remove any of the unevenness. And you can see we got a pretty good sheen now, and I was actually really, really excited about this. Oh, and if you do not regret the last 19 minutes and 30 seconds of your life, I would really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button.
Ready to go up? Okay. All right, straight back, then go down. We're on.
If you're like me and you like just highlighting what Mother Nature has already created and not giving it a big, thick, plasticky coat with epoxy or polyurethane, on top of the hard wax oil, I highly recommend putting on N3 Nano. It is basically a very, very micron thin nano layer, so it does provide a ton of protection, although I don't think this wall piece is going to need a lot of protection from spills. But why I'm putting it on here is how much it increases the sheen and contrast between that wood grain. Again, just highlighting what's already there, but you can still feel every single wood grain. It's a really, really remarkable product. And there's a link in the description if you want to check that out. I mentioned at the start of this video that this project was for my all-time favorite client, and that client is obviously me, because we share all the same opinions and I didn't have to run any decisions by myself. And here's how it looks in the end. Again, just some of the most remarkable wood I've ever seen. And speaking of remarkable wood, this next project that you're going to see is Myrtle wood. And if you haven't seen Myrtle wood, it is a really, really remarkable piece. It only grows wild a few places in the world. So I hope you enjoy this, one of the most beautiful pieces of wood I've ever seen. So I randomly stumbled on an Instagram post from a wood supplier just south of me that I'd never been to before, but they posted the most unbelievable Myrtle wood burl slabs I've ever seen anywhere in my life. And as unbelievable as they looked, they were also priced just about as unbelievably. But as everybody knows, something is worth what someone will pay for it. So I threw a couple posts out on Instagram and my YouTube community page and just said, hey, does anybody want a desk? And someone commented and they're like, yeah, I do. So I ended up driving down and paying that ridiculous price. This guy was awesome to talk to because he was super salty, but he was also super knowledgeable. So I learned quite a bit in my short time chatting with him there. And he's explaining that these slabs are not kiln dried. They're actually air dried only. So I'm testing the moisture on them. They're definitely within limits. And I actually had to take my wife's car to come pick these up because we had 114-degree weather, which is insane for Western Oregon. It never gets that hot, which led to my next problem that you'll see here in just a minute or two. I just can't seem to put my finger on what exactly this natural void reminds me of, but for some reason I am really, really drawn to it. The client had even originally asked me if there's any way we could have a hole through some portion of it so they could run some computer wires, and I thought this would be a perfect way to incorporate kind of a really organic wire management solution without having to cut any big holes, leave everything looking as natural as possible. I just wanted to make it a little bit more symmetrical before the glue up, so I busted out the electric die grinder and a couple of different cut saw bits. You might not have noticed, but when I was at the shop buying these slabs, he used his big, awesome $20,000 Martin jointer to give a nice, fresh joint on both of these slabs so I could take them straight to glue up. So all I needed to do was mark a couple spots for dominoes, bust out the Domino XL, and put a few of them in there to help with lining it up. And if you didn't know, dominoes, they claim, actually don't add any strength, which seems hard to believe, but that's what they say. They say that the domino only assists in lining things up, so don't add more dominoes to add more strength. The dominoes are really just there to help line it up, and all of the strength in the joint comes from the actual glue. Since I had the brand new fresh jointer edge that he had put on with his Martin jointer for me, and we're in the middle of this heat wave, I wanted to get this slab joined up as quickly as possible because tiny little fluctuations in the wood would make for a much less clean seam. So I wanted to hurry up and make sure I got it glued up as soon as possible, and that's what I'm doing here. It was really, really uncomfortably hot in my shop, but I thought I could just knock this out really quick, get it glued up, and then have that peace of mind and let it set for a couple days, let the shop cool down. But I ran into a problem. You can see here, start getting into panic mode. Normally the dominoes just slide together, and this was probably about 3 or 4 minutes, and the glue had basically seized up. You see I'm feeling it right there. It's just already completely tacky. There's nothing I could do. The slab was frozen in place right here. Well, first time that's ever happened. Glue set up on me too fast. I guess I couldn't quite get it in the 90-degree shop. So, I don't know, maybe pool day. Try again tomorrow. Or maybe a few days. Make no mistake, I am not blaming this on the temperature. This was a mistake that I made, and it's a hard lesson I had to learn, especially with some really, really expensive wood. And I'm not a big quotes person, but there is one quote that I absolutely love, and I'm paraphrasing it slightly, but it says, "Good decisions come from experience. Experience comes from bad decisions." And I really, really like that because this was my way of gaining a little bit of experience. And so what I did, I let that heat wave chill out just a little bit, let it cool down in my shop. I think it was in the mid 80s here, which was still pretty warm, but much better than being in the 90s, and worked on fixing it. Unlike in life, everything in woodworking is essentially fixable. It's just going to be how much work do you want to put in to do so. And this really wasn't even that bad. I had to cut the old dominoes off with my track saw, went over to my jointer, which is a pretty good one, but it's not nearly as good as the one that he used. So I had to make sure I had that fence perfectly square to the table, put a couple new domino holes in it, had the shop in a reasonable temperature. It wasn't great. It was still, I think, in the high 90s outside. So yeah, I was pretty nervous doing this again. If I had to cut this apart, a second or a third time, that's when we're going to start messing with the size of these slabs. So when this finally went together right here, I can't tell you how relieved I was and what a weight that was off my back. Just a matter of getting a couple of clamps on it at this point. And you can see I used a couple of shop rags to kind of keep me from damaging that really nice live edge. And now I can let this set overnight. These slabs come from a myrtle tree, and if you've never heard of myrtle wood before, don't feel bad because this tree is actually only native to the Oregon coast. So basically everywhere in the world, this wood is extremely uncommon except for Oregon, and the coast is loaded with these myrtle trees. The rest of the state doesn't really have any of them, so I see a fair amount, but they're still not super common. And you might be saying, wait a minute, I had a crepe myrtle in my yard at my old house, and first of all, so did I at my last house. We bought a crepe myrtle, and I had to Google it, but a crepe myrtle has no relation to a myrtle tree for the record. And if you're a close follower of my page, you've actually seen myrtle wood before because I used it for my blacktail sign that I hang up in my office, and it was in my old shop too. So myrtle wood's a really cool wood, and I hope this kind of opens it up as another potential wood for some of your projects. I am still not super happy with my live edge cleanup tools, and here I'm using a pretty soft wire wheel on my angle grinder, and this thing throws these little wires everywhere, so make sure you wear goggles. You don't want to catch one of those in the eye, but I end up looking like this every time I use it. Brought it inside. I do like this old Porter cable restorer that I have, and I have a soft wheel on that, but I think I need to look into some sort of walnut shell blasting or something like that, because I think there's got to be a better way to give a little bit cleaner finish when removing this bark, because when you have something live edge, you want to keep it as natural as possible. You don't want any gouges, any scars. So I really need to find a better way to clean it up. And after I got it cleaned up as good as I could, I went to kind of smoothing out some of these little burl nubs because you don't want these catching on your sweater, catching on something when you're sitting at your desk, or just overall poking you when you slide in close to your desk. So took all these down with some sandpaper and my fine rasps just to give it a little bit smoother feel. Sometimes I definitely see a place for letting the kind of natural cracks and voids speak for themselves in a tabletop. For a desk, though, I really prefer a pretty smooth surface. You're going to be writing on it, you're going to be shuffling papers around, you're going to have little objects, little tacks and paper clips and things like that. So I really prefer a pretty smooth top, and it does take a lot more work. I spent several hours with these little kind of dental tools, fishing out all these little imperfections. And if you're wondering what that shellac was for, that was to seal it because I'm going to fill these tiny little voids with a black epoxy, and that's going to prevent any of the staining by having that shellac down there first. After I spent a few hours filling all of these little tiny annoying pits and voids, I was ready to start work on the underside of the table. And I personally almost always prefer a recessed table base. And one of the questions I always get when I do this is, what does it do for you? Does it add strength somehow? Why do you recess it? Is it just for looks? And that's exactly it. It is just for looks. It does absolutely nothing for the table. In fact, if you're going to change table bases down the road, it could actually hinder you because now you're really kind of locked into having to mount it in this recessed area. So make sure you have a table base you want to keep on there for a really long time. And if that is the case, then I highly recommend recessing it. It just looks a lot sleeker. If you look down the profile of the table, you don't see a 1/4-inch mounting plate, you just see the nice, sleek legs. I don't add C-channels to the underside of every single table I make. In fact, the last desk I built was actually quite a bit bigger than this one, and I did not add C-channels to it. And this one is a little bit smaller, and I am adding C-channels to it. And so some of you are probably wondering why that is. And This isn't one of those hard lessons I've learned. I actually don't have physical evidence for why you should do it one way and shouldn't do it another way, but I do have kind of my hunch and my reasoning for doing it. And the main reason is that these slabs were air dried. They weren't kiln dried, and the moisture was just a little bit higher than they would be than on a kiln dried slab. They ranged from about 10 to maybe 13%, even I think 14% in some areas. So this was going to a different climate. It was going to be in the Philadelphia area. And I really wanted to mitigate any chance of any warping or cupping. And these C-channels won't prevent absolutely everything if this slab was totally improperly dried, which it wasn't. It was properly dried. It was just air dried. And so having these C-channels in there is really going to just kind of help negotiate with the slab to keep it flat. And that's not my term. That is Paul from Canadian Woodworks. He came up with that term, and I really like that. They're just negotiating with the slab to help keep it flat. A year or two ago, I had a real problem in that I wanted to cut a deep bevel or chamfer in the side of a table, but nobody seems to make a router bit with a cutting depth of over 1 inch. And even if they did make a router bit bigger than that, I probably don't have a router powerful enough to push that bit. So what I came up with was using my track saw slightly overlapped on the slab, and this enables me to cut a really easy bevel or chamfer of any slab up to maybe 2.5 inches, probably even a little bit more if I use my larger Mappa saw. I have a really important woodworking trick for you that I'm embarrassed to say I'm not sure that I've shown in a video before, and I didn't come up with this. This is something a much more experienced woodworker showed me, but that is to wrap your slabs in plastic when you're done working with them for the day. So when I'm going to bed for the night, I wrap it up in that painter's plastic. I put a blanket over the top of it just to kind of weight that plastic down, and that really mitigates the wood movement and that bowing and cupping that can happen with slabs like this. I was just doing some math, and as of today, September 1st, 2021, I am on pace to hit 1 million subscribers by the end of the year. Actually, a little bit before the end of the year, which would be absolutely crazy, and I don't want to jinx it, but that would be really amazing if I could hit that goal of 1 million subscribers by the end of the year. So if you are enjoying this video, if you think that I've earned that subscription, don't do it for charity, but if you do think that you want to see more content like this, I would really appreciate it if you would hit that subscribe button right now, because if I do hit 1 million by the end of the year, I promise I'm going to do a huge giveaway. It's going to be a bunch of cool stuff with way more than one winner. Oh, and yes, I was diverting your attention from that particular inlay there because I completely botched it, and I was able to fix it, but stick around for another minute or two to see how that turned out, because that particular inlay was very bad. I don't know what it was about working with this particular wire management void, but I found it really satisfying, but also really frustrating. Felt like every time that I had it finished, something would go wrong and I had to start all over from scratch. I tried larger tools, and that seemed to be actually too big for the void. I tried smaller ones. Basically every tool in my toolbox I threw at this thing, and luckily for me, after enough perseverance, I was finally able to finish it off. I still had a few more little touch-ups to do just to make it absolutely perfect, and these were done with CA glue and activator. And unlike the epoxy that really takes at least a day between working with it, the CA glue with activator is ready to go in about 10-15 seconds. So I do the epoxy for the slightly larger touch-ups, and then I switch to the CA glue for the really small ones. All right, now we get to see just how bad this first iteration of the inlay looks, and this is something I probably should have seen coming. I normally don't use epoxy for my inlays for the exact reason why this one didn't look good. Also, my inlay wasn't super tight, so that didn't contribute to making it look any better. But you'll see right here just how it looks, and that is absolutely unacceptable. That is not going to make it out of my shop looking like that. Really didn't want to redo this, but I did not have a choice. I was not going to let that go out like that. So what I did, I went to my more traditional inlay method. I've got a regular square of this matching Myrtle wood, used a trim router, which was a little bit sketchy using this tiny little 1/8 of an inch bit, hogged out most of the material with this, then went to my chisels, cleaned up my marking knife line, went right up to the line, trying to be as sharp and as careful as I could be. And then the big difference is I'm using wood glue instead of epoxy, and wood glue always gives you a much more discreet inlay, and to fill any tiny little micro imperfections, I'm just using a little bit of myrtle wood dust mixed with some white oak dust, just to kind of mix up that color slightly. Normally I try to limit my failures to 1 per video so I don't get too judged by you guys, but this was my second failure on a relatively small project, but In the end, here's how it looked, and I'm actually pretty pleased with that. I was still a little bit nervous when I was sanding it down that what if it doesn't look good again, but that actually looks pretty good, and I'm really, really happy with that. If you spend enough time around woodworkers, you'll start to hear the same wood species names get thrown around when people start talking about the world's most expensive wood species. And those woods are generally like African blackwood, some species of ebony, some species of rosewood, maybe like a figured bubinga. But one that I had never heard of, and this one actually comes up on some list if you Google it, and this was from watching an Amazon show that had nothing to do with woodworking, is sandalwood. And I had heard of sandalwood and I didn't think it looked very pretty, and so I couldn't figure out why sandalwood was so sought after. And apparently, as I learned in this documentary, is they use it for making different fragrances. And the wood is so protected now that it only grows in a few national parks, and if they have to cut a tree down because it's dead, they even save the sawdust and chainsaw clippings so they can sell those as well. So kind of a fun fact about the world's most expensive woods that you might not have heard of, sandalwood. The reason I bring up the world's most expensive woods is that these slabs are right up there with the most expensive wood I have ever even seen on a per board foot basis. And per board foot basis basically means pound for pound. 1 board feet equals 12 inches by 12 inches by 1 feet. And for comparison, walnut might start around $10 a board foot, then for the nice stuff go to $20, then for the really nice stuff it might be like $40 or $50 a board foot. And then if you get into something like that exotic ebony or bubinga, I've seen that for like $90 to $100 a board foot. These slabs combined were $3,900, which if you do the math, they were 5 feet long by about 2.5 feet wide by 1 3/4 inches thick. So that equals $178 per board foot, which is really just staggering that I paid that. Even though it was a ton of money to spend on these slabs, I do not regret it in the slightest. In fact, I feel incredibly lucky that I got the opportunity to work with such rare, such incredible wood. And in that YouTube community post where I found my buyer, I think I even included the price of the wood and just said, hey, these slabs are really expensive. They're $3,900. I can do a desk all in with legs and everything for $10,000. And yes, that is a staggering amount of money in itself, but it really isn't the markup that I would normally have using wood like this. So the client, believe it or not, getting a $10,000 desk actually got a deal. So the client was really happy. I was happy. The wood supplier seemed happy. Although he told me, he goes, if nobody bought these slabs, I would just cut them up into guitar blanks and probably make twice as much money. It just might take me 2 years. So it's kind of funny that even at $180 a board foot, he still probably could have made more money in the long run. I still rely on a ton of other people to help with my woodworking projects. I outsource a lot of the big slab flattening or table flattening to the Creative Woodworking up in Portland. I outsource all of my steel leg fabrication to actual professional fabricators. However, I now am able to do all of my finishing in-house, which is really, really nice because I like this particular style of finish so much more. You actually get to feel the wood grain. It's not like a clear, thick, plasticky coat on it. You can repair it on site, and it is also quite durable. So if you have some questions on how to do this finish, if you're curious, how can I get a perfect finish in a really, really dusty shop? I have a step-by-step blog and video that gives all the steps to get an absolutely perfect finish in a dusty shop. This particular spot seemed to really, really soak in the oil, and I don't know why it was so much more saturated than the rest of the slab, but it did take a little bit more. And anyway, after I had the entire slab oiled, I got a couple of blue shop rags, and then I just buffed all of the oil off possible. You don't want to leave any of it on there, and that's different than some finishes, but this particular one, you want to remove all of it. And my wife came out when I was doing this, and she told me not to wipe it back to front, but she doesn't even woodwork, so I don't know what she could be referring to. Before I released N3 Nano, I had used every imaginable nano finish I could get my hands on. In fact, I didn't really have any desire to start my own nano finish company. However, when I tested the very first prototype sample of N3 Nano, I was blown away. And I told the company, I was like, I don't want to sell this for you. I want you to manufacture this for me. Are you interested in that? And they said, absolutely. That is exactly what we do. So N3 Nano is head and shoulders above every other nano finish that I used. And the proof behind that is that, again, I didn't want my own nano finish company. I am very comfortable doing what I'm doing now, but it was maybe the most excited I've ever been about a product. And it's just one of the reasons why I love it is what you see here is you still get to feel that wood grain. You get all that natural look, but but you just get the crazy increase in sheen and protection and contrast. Just a really fun time to be around woodworking because I feel like finishes have been so stagnant for so long that now we finally have kind of the future of wood finishing. The legs I'm using here are one of my personal favorite styles. They're called a wishbone leg, and it's just a really timeless classic style. And the manufacturer of these is Flowy Line Design, which I have used a bunch of times before, but I've never got to use his stainless leg. So I showed these to the client, actually showed the client a lot of different table legs, and these are the ones he landed on. So I was thrilled to get to use these. And if you want a link to purchase these, I will include a link to those in the description below as well. Here is how that inlay ended up, which I don't know that it's perfect, but I also don't know that I can do a better job than that. All in all, I would say, oh dear. Now I think I see what everybody else saw. Why didn't anybody just tell me? Oh man, I hope YouTube's algorithm doesn't catch this. Hang on a second. Okay, my wife is the legal expert, and I ran this edit by her to see what she thought, and she insists that I am not as funny as I think I am and to just post the video. This next piece of wood is incredibly beautiful, but incredibly difficult to work with. It is called Mappa Burl, and no, that is not maple burl. It is an entirely different wood species, and it is incredibly soft, but again, incredibly beautiful. Before I got started on this project, I didn't even know what I was going to do with this giant slab of Mappa Burl, so I held a poll on my Instagram page, and I just asked, hey, should I cut this up into smaller pieces or should I try to keep it in one huge piece? And not surprisingly, 75% of the people said to keep it as one big slab, 25% said to cut it up into smaller pieces. So there was no way I was going to let down 25% of my audience, so I decided to cut it up into two smaller pieces. I have really only been woodworking for about 6 or 7 years now, and in the woodworking universe, that is not a very long amount of time, but for some reason or another, I've had a little bit of success, and the pieces I sell now are able to go for a price point that I never expected. And even before I had the YouTube success, I was selling pieces, from $5,000 to $30,000, which I will acknowledge is a crazy amount of money and somewhere where I never thought I would be. And at times, it makes me feel like a bit of a fraud. I feel like I'm not doing anything that anybody could do if they just put their mind to it. So in this video, I've kind of outlined a bunch of steps that I've taken that will, I don't want to say trick people, but kind of trick people into thinking that you are a better woodworker than you are. And here's the first step, is just buy beautiful wood. And it doesn't always have to be expensive. This slab was expensive. It was about $3,000. But just using beautiful wood is a huge step into convincing people that you're actually a good woodworker when maybe you're still just learning. The wood that I'm using here is called Mappa Burl, and yes, Mappa Burl is different than maple burl. I had someone in my last video mock me because I apparently didn't know how to say the word maple. If you don't know, maple comes from a maple tree. Mappa comes from a poplar tree. They are completely different species, and this one is actually a very soft wood. It's in the hardwood family, but it's soft, and don't get me started on that. Anyway, I am just cleaning out these voids, making sure it is nice and prepped because these voids here are going to get filled with a black epoxy, but not a black epoxy like I normally use. I actually have a totally new trick for this. This trick will save you tons of anguish if you work with epoxy at all, and this goes for small voids or large epoxy pours. And that is the liquid dyes that I normally use are really good because they're a very nice, consistent color, but they are incredibly prone to staining your wood, especially softer woods like this. So when I am filling voids like this Mappa Burl here, I am going to be using charcoal as my pigment. Charcoal, believe it or not, does not dissolve in water or in epoxy, and it will not stain the wood at all, but it is jet black, and I mean very, very black. And I haven't used this on a big table yet. I'm tempted to, but still a little bit nervous on doing it on a large scale pour, but for filling these small voids, it is perfect. Up until a few months ago, I had very limited experience working with woods that were pretty soft, like this Mappa Burl and that redwood that you see on the wall behind me, but recently, for some reason, I've been taking on a bunch of these softer wood projects, and they are a real pain. If you can avoid it, don't work with any of these woods that are this soft. These are just a nightmare to work with. There's a lot of upside. They can be absolutely beautiful, but they aren't a great beginner project. And this is one of the problems that I found when working with these very softwoods is normally I like to cut the bulk of that chamfer off with the track saw, and then I'll come back and just nip it with this oversized router bit that I had made. However, with this very softwood, I got a bunch of tear out, which led to way more problems, and that track saw cut was actually much cleaner. So lesson learned on this particular part, but in the end, it's all fixable, just something I had to learn. My next tip on appearing to be a better woodworker than you actually are is to hemorrhage money on tools. And you know what? I'm only partially joking here. I once heard a professional golfer interviewed, and they asked him, they said, hey, what do you think of the amateur golfer that comes out with the $2,000 set of custom clubs and he's like a 20 handicap? And he said, yeah, he could probably benefit from those custom clubs a lot more than I could, and therefore really needs them more than the professional golfer. And the same goes for woodworking. Is if you are a master carpenter with, 40 years of experience, you could take some Stanley chisels and probably do some incredible work. However, if you are an amateur, you're going to benefit from those nice tools even more so than the professional. And you need to do it responsibly, but everybody has the thing that they're into. They have their own hobby. Some people buy a new car every year. Some people like to go on expensive vacations. Some people even like to have kids, or whatever it is you want to spend your money on, that's fine. And if your thing is nice tools, you don't have to have a certain baseline of woodworking ability before buying those new tools. I say buy them sooner than later. You can see so far, there really hasn't been a ton of woodworking skill involved in this build up to this point. There's been a lot of, having to be meticulous and taking your time, and a few tips and tricks to avoid some problems like the staining with the epoxy, using that charcoal instead of a liquid dye. And that just comes from experience or watching a lot of YouTube videos. And here I am just kind of smoothing out those burl nubs. And I kind of hate doing this because I love the way they look, but as I mentioned, everything I make has to be really a functional piece in someone's home, and someone's not going to be thrilled if their suit or sweater or pants or dog or child gets caught by one of these sharp burl nubs. So I try to keep them as natural looking as I can, but just kind of take the edge off, so to speak. This next part is a part I absolutely anguish over, and my wife would absolutely love it. If she didn't work so hard at her job, I would definitely get her doing this. And in the past, I've told people this woodworking tip, and that was to get a wife with OCD, because if you have a wife with OCD, she will come and pick apart every little thing that you do and make sure nothing gets out of your shop that isn't perfection. And whenever I've mentioned that in a video, people always give me a hard time, saying that it's very insensitive of me to confuse perfectionism with OCD, which is a psychological disorder. However, you should know that definitions change and adapt to meet society. Like you may or may not know, the definition of the word literally has literally been changed to also mean not literally. You can look it up, it's kind of interesting. And to that point, the definition of the word OCD has also been expanded to also mean just perfectionism used as an adjective. The definition also actually states it is slightly offensive to some people, so at least they got that part right too. While I might not like filling little burl pits, this is a part that I absolutely love. This is the fun stuff for me, getting a little bit experimental with it, taking some inspiration from outside and kind of applying it, and really just trying to make it my own. And I'm not saying I invented any part of this. This is something I'm really just copying from the guitar makers. This is going to be similar to a black table I did a few months ago, but what I'm trying on this one is I'm trying to do kind of a, I don't know if it's a sunburst, but a burst where it goes from a really dark on the outside to pretty light in the center, like you see on the PRS guitars. And I reached out to a guy at Coca Guitars, and he gave me some tips. And really what he said is, he goes, hey, if you don't like it, just sand it off and add more dye. And so that's what I did. There's no book on how to make a desk out of Mappa Burl this way. So I added a lot of dye. At this point, I didn't like it. It was too dark. It didn't have any fade to it. I thought it would be a little bit better. So I wasn't really discouraged at this point. I just realized, hey, I'm going to sand it back, add some more dye, and eventually we'll get it right. Because this fade wasn't really turning out the way I'd hoped, I went back and I looked for some more inspiration. I got on the Instagram guitar pages. I got on PRS's website. I found the guitars that I loved, and I saw what they were doing that I wasn't doing very well. And I do this with all my woodworking. This can be another tip for you is I have a virtual epoxy workshop where we have like 3 hours of content and we go through every step to make an epoxy table in your home shop or garage. And in one of the first chapters, we discuss how do you choose an amazing layout. And this was sneakily hard for me to learn when I started because not a lot of people were making these tables. So I couldn't really look to inspiration from other people. So what I did is I looked to nature and I saw, wow, why does this aerial photo of a river look amazing and my river looks so stupid? And it was using nature as that inspiration and mimicking it that enabled me to do something that other people weren't doing and really kind of separated my tables from others. And in this workshop, we have lots of tips like that. If you want more information on it, there's a link in the description below. And depending on when you're watching this, sometimes I add a bonus in there so you can check out that link and see if it's currently available. What I learned when I went back and looked at those other guitars for inspiration is I wasn't going aggressive enough on my fade. And I didn't want the black to kind of light white or natural wood in the center, which I've seen some guitars that do it that way and they're cool in their own right, but wasn't quite the look I was going for. I still wanted kind of a gray silver center. And so what I did was I went really aggressive on sanding that center section back, came back with some lighter dye, and this time you could really see a noticeable fade from that darker edge to the center. This next step is really critical anytime you're doing an epoxy flood coat, and I don't know that my method is the end-all best possible method. It's something that's been working for me for a little while now, and that is to seal the wood with thinned out epoxy first. And someone commented in my last video said that you can do it with polyurethane. I've personally tried that and had really bad results. I had a ton of these little micro bubbles, and it's not bubbles that come from me not popping them with a torch. It's bubbles that actually are air escaping the wood, something you can't pop with a torch. So what I do now is I take this epoxy, I thin it out a little bit, let as much soak in as possible, and then I just scrape off all the excess and then pop the bubbles like I would normally with a torch. And I actually did 2 coats of this, and this seems to seal it up really nicely for this epoxy flood coat. I made a couple mistakes during this epoxy top coat. First thing is I brought my food scale out and I thought this would be a good way to measure it. Then halfway through, I realized that the epoxy is a 1-to-1 mix by volume, not by weight, and they weigh different amounts. So I was a little nervous there. The other mistake I made is I had everything ready to be cleaned. I was waiting to wipe the table down until right before the pour, because any dust that settled, I wanted to wipe it off just at the very last moment. And then I forgot to do that once we started rolling with the camera. So as I did this pour, I saw tons of little specks of dust and dirt and hairs in there, and I couldn't figure out why it was so bad until I remembered, oh yeah, I forgot to actually wipe it down. So knew this coat wasn't going to be my last coat, so I had to do at least one more, and lesson learned there. I let that top coat cure for a couple days, and while it might look pretty good from this angle, trust me, it is not very nice at this point. And you might think that right now I'm like Bob Ross used to do when he'd have the painting that looked amazing and then he'd put a brush stroke right down the middle and you'd think, Bob, you ruined it. And then 10 brush strokes later, you're like, oh no, he totally saved it. That looks amazing. Hopefully I can do the same for this table, and I haven't ruined it up to this point, and I am making sure to get it perfectly clean. I guess this isopropyl alcohol, 90-something%, is the best thing to clean these epoxy tables with before you do that next layer. And took quite a bit of wiping with these microfibers, and this is what I forgot on the last one, the tack cloth. This is just kind of a sticky cloth that automotive guys use to wipe the piece down just before they spray that finish on there. And hopefully at this point, I'm clean and ready for the final epoxy top coat. Every time I do an epoxy top coat, I swear I'm never going to do another one. And I feel like I've probably said that before in these videos, even though I don't specifically remember saying it. I just know that I've felt it a lot, and in these commentaries, I tend to say what I'm feeling. So I apologize if that's getting repetitive, and this time I'll finally accept it. This will not be my last epoxy top coat. I know I'll get suckered in to do it again because it looks amazing when it's done. There's no substitute for that kind of 3D effect. Although I did just get a spray gun, and I'm really excited to try to learn how to use that because I do not know how to spray at all. I have found, and I bet most of you will agree with this, that one of the best ways to see if a craftsman or woodworker or YouTuber actually likes a tool sponsor is to see if they actually use that tool in their shop. And the same should go for sit-stand desks, apparently, because after seeing this unit in action on this desk, I called them, I requested an additional unit for my personal desk, which I am actually using to do this voiceover right now. The assembly of the desk base was exceptionally easy. It's one of those assemblies you could do without instructions, which is how I feel all assemblies should be, but aren't for some reason. And I love this feature here. It's something I wish I had on more of the bases that I use. You can expand and contract the width of the desk to get the perfect width that you want for your desk. Also, this is pretty interesting. I was going to use those normal oversized bolts there and drill some larger holes, but they use this really clever rubber grommets that are oversized, so they cut down on vibrations and also give room for seasonal wood movement. So I thought that was pretty clever and actually used their mounting system on this big slab desk. Now that I got the easy part done, it is on to the painfully difficult part of this epoxy top coat. And epoxy is supposed to be self-leveling, but you saw there, this was far from level. There was plenty of waves in it, and it has a lot of variables. The environmental conditions, how hot it is, the temperature of the epoxy itself, and just how level and perfect my setup was. And so I wanted a much flatter surface, and I've never actually done this before on epoxy. I got a kind of a full-size block sander, and I was going to block sand this like they do a car, but block sanding a car is a lot easier because primer sands really nicely, Bondo sands really nicely. Epoxy is horrible. This thing gummed up so bad. I had to clean it out with the vacuum, sand a little bit more, clean it out with the vacuum, and it was one of the worst things I've ever done. It was so dusty. I got this new tool here. I think it's pretty cool. It's like a battery powered ventilator cap thing, and it keeps your face actually nice and cool because it's pumping cold air in. I thought that was pretty neat. So got back to work, more block sanding, and I spent, I think, about 6 hours this day just doing this. I was physically sore the next day. It was a horrible process. Never do this. If you're wondering, I was using 800 grit sandpaper, and yes, I could go lower and that would have gone a little faster, but I'm at much higher risk of screwing it up and not getting those scratches out and having some really heavy scratches remain when I was completely finished. And this was dry only sandpaper. It was not to be used wet, but eventually I was just sick of the dust and I said, I don't know, let's see what happens when we use dry sandpaper wet. And you know what? It worked fine. I had to replace it every, 30 or 40 seconds, but I was having to do that anyway. So use the dry sandpaper wet, and you know what? Not so bad. This little lip on the bottom was kind of interesting. It was where the epoxy flowed down over the edge, but kind of just wicked up a little bit on the end, and wicked probably isn't the right word, but it just kind of bulged out. So I used my scraper, got it as flat as I could without risk of kind of burning through that epoxy into that black finish or that black dye. Came back, got it sanded nice and smooth. I tried to stay pretty high grits. I think I didn't go lower than 500. Then eventually started wet sanding up to the 1500 and eventually 3000, which is where I take this top. Some of you might remember a past build where I got all the way finished with a table, and that's sanding through 3000 grit and then stage 1 compound and then stage 2 compound, where I saw some deep scratches that were left in the epoxy, probably from the 600 grit sanding, and I was devastated. That was so much lost time. So this time wasn't going to happen to me. I was so paranoid. So even though I was block sanding with 800 grit, I went with 600 grit here, took several discs, sanded one direction, came back, sanded the other direction with 600 grit again, did the same thing with 800 grit, did the same thing with 1000 grit. Now I am wet sanding with 1500 grit. This is the 3M Trizac, and this should keep me safe, hopefully. If you can appreciate or at least respect the fact that I don't bombard you early in the video before I've actually shown you anything, asking you to like, subscribe, all those things, which, by the way, I am convinced that likes don't actually do anything. You can actually keep your like or even thumbs down this video if you want. I don't think it makes any difference. What does make a big difference, though, is the subscriptions. And if you think that I've earned your subscription, if you enjoyed this video, if you want to see more videos like it, I would genuinely appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. Another tip I can give you that will not only help trick people into thinking you're a better woodworker than you are, but will actually genuinely make you a better woodworker is don't be afraid for your projects to end up in the dumpster. You have no idea how many of my projects I've just thrown away. They just ended up stupid. I didn't like them, threw them away. But every now and again, I get lucky. I did this burnt wood and epoxy table several years ago, it's still my most viewed YouTube video. It's like 25 million views, which is pretty crazy. I actually have another video kind of similar to that coming up. I was positive. I told my video guy, I'm like, I give this a 10% chance of success, and somehow it actually worked, and it's pretty freaking cool. Speaking of wanting to throw things in the dumpster, yes, I screwed up with my sanding once again. I did not sand well enough. So this is kind of a Hail Mary. I'm going with my extremely heavy cut compound and my wool bonnet, which is supposedly a much more aggressive bonnet. And at this point, I'm planning on having to sand all the way down just like I did last time, but figured I would at least give it one shot here. Oh, I think I got lucky. As I'm editing this, I realize you guys really don't get to see happy Cam very often. It always seems to be a string of mistakes and me just kind of looking on in anguish. But believe it or not, I do get happy, and that was one of the moments that I was actually pretty thrilled. That heavy cut and that wool bonnet actually took those scratches out. It was pretty amazing. Here's a side-by-side of before and after. So pretty much dodged a bullet there and was rather excited and not afraid to smile for once. That experience reminds me of another tip I can give you to trick people into thinking you're a better woodworker than you are, and that's just to care more than the next guy or gal. There are so many people out there that are much more skilled that wouldn't have made a mistake that big, but maybe the mistake they did make, they just wanted that piece out the door. Maybe they got bills to pay, maybe they got a production schedule to meet, and they just send it out anyway, even though they have more skills than me. And that's probably the most impactful tip I can give you out of all these, is just keep trying, care enough to make it right, and it will really separate you from a staggering amount of more talented woodworkers. I make a lot of jokes about the negative feedback I get in my comment section by a very, very small minority of people, because for the most part, I think it's pretty funny. But one of the most helpful groups out there is the automotive guys. I have gotten so many amazing buffing and polishing tricks from those guys that I would have never been able to do this table. So big thanks to all those tips I've gotten from you guys. All right, here's how the standing desk functions, and yeah, it works as advertised. And I don't know that I'm gonna win any woodworking awards for putting a standing desk under this really remarkable wood top. However, in this day of everybody working from home, a lot of people really need the form over function, and I feel like with this top, you get just enough of both worlds. And I really, really like how this black turned out. I don't know that I would want such a high gloss piece as my everyday desk. I'd be really afraid of scratching it. But again, there is something for everybody out there. I do love the way this looks. If I was to learn to play the guitar, I would have a guitar that looked exactly like this. Like I mentioned earlier, that kind of PRS inspired look. And let me know what you think though. Do you like the black or the natural? And that one on the right there, I also have a video on that one if you're interested. The next wood species I'm going to show you is Bastogne walnut, and not just one piece, but a 3-table package, all for the same customer though. And this is kind of a redemption story. This one started out as a complete disaster, but by the time I was finished, I think it had the best possible ending. If you aren't one of the precious few people that actually consider yourself a fan of my channel, let me catch you up to speed. About 6 months ago, I was finishing a 3-table $30,000 package for a couple over in Europe. I got almost all the way done with all 3 tables after the clients had already been waiting over a year, and I found trapped moisture inside the wood, essentially rendering all 3 tables unusable. I was despondent. I didn't know what to do. I had to have a very uncomfortable call with them where I said, "Hey, I messed up. Do you want your money back?" And they said, "No, we'd like to stick with you, even if that means waiting another 6 or 8 months for our tables." And that's why I consider this to be the double or nothing, or the redemption build, because I can't get it wrong this time. Some of you are probably wondering, how do you guarantee you don't have the same exact problem with trapped moisture that you did last time again on these slabs? And the answer is embarrassingly simple. All I have to do is check the moisture content with a pinless moisture meter. And this one's by Wagner. It's the Orion 950, and it's an investment. It's like $550, but it could have saved me anywhere from $4,000 to $30,000 depending on how you look at that last build. So I make sure every single slab that I buy now is checked, not just in one spot, but in multiple spots.
Feel good about it? I feel good about the moisture content of this wood, at least.
I will say my wood supplier, Gobi Walnut, really stepped up. He said, "Hey, what can I do to make up for those slabs that weren't properly dried?" And these slabs were even nicer than the last ones, but they cost almost triple. These 2 slabs were about $12,000, and I said, if you really want to make it up to the clients, you can give them these slabs at no additional cost. And he said, absolutely, no problem. So in the end, the client is actually getting wood that is much, much nicer at no additional cost to them.
Good stop.
I didn't even stop it. I was letting it go. After I composed myself from nearly dropping a $6,000 slab of wood minutes into ownership, I got to work on choosing the layout, and this is exactly what I did on the previous build with these clients, so they knew what to expect. And this is a lengthy process. This can be a challenge because you have a husband, you have a wife, and you have a woodworking YouTuber that all think that they know best. However, they're paying me, so I do my best to help them make the best decision for themselves, because in the end, the decision really is on them, and they should get exactly what they want. But it's my job to help them make that decision, and it's a fun process. I actually really enjoy doing that, and these clients were great to work with. There's a lot about these builds and these videos that I can't control. I really can't control the finished color tone of the wood. I can't control how long these slabs take to dry in the kiln. I can't control how many people comment saying, how dumb do you have to be 12 months into a $30,000 project and not even check the moisture content of the wood? That sounds suspicious. We think that you're lying just to get more views. Which, by the way, I really wish I was lying about that, but I am, or at least I was that dumb. However, one of the things I have total control over is how methodical and how delicate I am cleaning up these slabs, because I really think that separates the okay tables from the extraordinary tables, and that's why I really take my time. I want to make sure I don't break off any chunks and keep it as absolutely as natural as possible.
When you plane it, is it gonna
go through the other side? No, I think we still have plenty of room there. Went through. Okay, if my customers are watching, that one was also out of my control. The rest of the slab clamp though, that is within my control. Anyway, after that last video debacle, I had the people from Wagner Moisture Meters reach out and they said, hey, what about this upcoming redemption video? Can we be a part of that one? And I was like, well, people like free stuff and I like my viewers. Do you want to give away some stuff to my viewers? And they're like, yeah, we do. And so they have put together a prize package. I think there's going to be 3 winners. Again, these moisture meters are like $550 a piece, so there's going to be at least 3 of those, and I think they're throwing in some more stuff as well. So there's a link in the video description if you want to check that out.
Makes me a little nervous.
What do you think?
You'll be fine with the paddles.
Only if there's a video showing what could happen if a jointer accident goes bad. I think we'll be fine. That was a quick clip from my woodworking accidents in slow motion video that I did a few months ago. That's a great watch if you love woodworking and hate falling asleep peacefully at night. The reason I was so needlessly doing that sketchy operation on the jointer is to get this perfect fit on the complementary piece for the console table. And anytime I do any dangerous acts on a YouTube video here, I always worry that someone's going to watch this video and do the same thing and have a horrible accident. And I have to say, if you do that, make sure the camera's rolling and tag me in the comments. If you've never seen a twin turbo vise, this is a twin turbo vise. It's made by a guy named Andy Klein. He's just a normal dude. He's a woodworker I met on Instagram. But the main difference is he's got a brain that's like 2 pounds heavier than mine and can actually invent stuff. And that vise doesn't just look cool, it's also the best vise I've ever used. Now I had to try to fix this spot that I blew through from the other side and hopefully make it look like it was never there. And for that, I'm using some clear epoxy, and luckily it was still a pretty tight fit, so I'm hoping that friction is going to be good enough to hold that in place and make it look like it was never there. And after that, there was a handful of these kind of small to medium cracks. It wasn't the worst slab, wasn't the best slab I've ever worked with, but what was coming up next was something I was absolutely dreading, and now I had to tackle it. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but building a full 8-foot epoxy table form is actually easier than doing just one of these corners. And this corner is only about 2 feet by 18 inches or so, but it is much more difficult than just building a big form, dropping your table in and pouring the epoxy. The advantage, of course, is I'm using much less epoxy, which I love. The problem is it is tough to get a perfect seal around an odd shape like this. You're bound to get leaks, and then when you surface it, you run into a whole bunch of problems there as well. If you've been considering building your first epoxy table, or maybe you want to get a little bit better at making these tables to try to generate some revenue and pay for this expensive hobby that we have, I highly recommend checking out my virtual epoxy workshop. It is over 3.5 hours long, it's 32 chapters, and actually after that last video debacle, I ended up adding 2 new chapters just on the wood buying process. I added 2 additional chapters on the wood finishing process because as I learn more, I continue to update that workshop. I'll never do an epoxy workshop 2.0 and make you pay more. As I learn more, I share more, and it's something I'm incredibly proud of. We've sold several thousand of these over the 1.5 years or so that it's been out, and I still engage with people every week. I answer every single question that they leave in the comments to the best of my ability anyway, and right now we're running the spring sale. We only do a couple of sales a year, so if you've been considering it, highly recommend checking that out. There's a link in the video description. You can see that the slab isn't really a perfect square at this point, and that's actually by design, although it does cause this form making to be a little bit more difficult. And this corner is essentially squared off, so this one wasn't so bad. It was the other corner that still has a bit of a taper, and the reason why I'm leaving it oversized at this point is I have run into so many problems over the years by cutting my pieces too small too early, and then I have a problem that I didn't expect, and I wish I had that buffer, those extra inches, to enable me to get the table the exact size and the exact shape that I want. And quick spoiler, I actually run into that exact problem on this table, and I'm really thankful I have those extra inches. Almost a year ago now, I hired Scott, my full-time videographer and editor, and he is incredible at what he does. He's a great videographer, he's great at editing, and it was honestly the best thing I've ever done for my business. And on top of all that, it's great to have a sounding board in the shop because sometimes you don't realize how dumb you actually are, or at least I don't realize how dumb I am, because Scott is legitimately much smarter than me, and here he came up with a great tip.
You should try poking a hole in it, like you're shotgunning a beer.
Never thought of that. Will it work?
Oh, I feel like it should.
All right, I'm gonna do it. You going? Yep. All right, we're shotgunning. Oh my God. Oh my God. Look at it go. Look at it.
Do you know how many of these I have poured like an asshole? Oh, what a time to be alive. This might not be a huge shock to some of you out there, but I'm doing black epoxy with this walnut, and especially with this particular walnut because it is so freaking nice. I think it would be a tragedy to use any other color other than black. The brown and the blacks and these streaks in there really just complement each other. And if you want to see something different though, I have a build coming up that might be the coolest thing I've ever built. I can't say too much about it because I don't want someone to beat me to it because I've never seen anybody else do what I'm trying to do. But there's no walnut, there's no black epoxy, and that's about all I can say. And it's not my mammoth tusk, which I'm also doing a video on restoring a real life mammoth tusk. I bought a 115 pound, like 7-foot long tusk, and I'm going to restore it. And that is also going to be super cool. And if you want to make sure you don't miss out on any of those future builds, I would really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button, if I've earned it, and you actually want to see more of this stuff.
All right, it's been about 2 minutes and we got our first leak, which Scott, the video guy, was not surprised on because this was just such a weird angle. But flex paste, and this is all new, so it shouldn't be dried out. All right, let's see if that lasts.
If you want to try to build one of these epoxy tables, one of the best tips I can give you is to get some of this flex paste and keep it on hand just in case you get a leak. I often get a lot of comments from people that say to just use that roof patch stuff, and that roof patch, that tar type stuff, is meant to hold water out, not to hold water in. And I've tried it and it does not stop epoxy in the slightest. So do yourself a favor, get some flex paste. Also, if you want a favor on which mold release to use, I learned a hard lesson because I tried to buy some cheap stuff, and here is the one you do not want to use.
Hold on.
Get this, I wanna show this. If you ever see this brand, go the other way. I wanna make perfectly clear, whoever monster sells this should be up there with Philip Morris and the tobacco community. It can't even go in the garbage can. I will leave a link to a mold release that I do like and I know works in the video description, and that will be an affiliate link. However, if you are tired of YouTubers taking money out of the pockets of the Jeff Bezoses of the world and you do not want to support my channel, definitely do not click on those video links and just do a standard Google search instead. I got everything loaded up to go to Creative Woodworking Northwest, a place up in Portland that rents me time out on their big industrial machines. And one of the caveats you have to using these machines is they say if you hit metal, it's like a $300 charge because it tears up their belts in the sander and they have to fix a bunch of things and can even break the blades in the planer head. And one of the exceptions, luckily I learned, is that lead is acceptable, and that's what we found there. And I thought this was perfectly fitting because we found a lead bullet, and this is going to Europe, and Europeans, everybody knows, loves guns. So they got a nice little surprise for their table there. I actually thought the bullet was really cool, and I was hoping the clients would let me keep it in the table, so I was banking on them knowing US knowledge about as well as I know European knowledge. And so I told them it was most likely a Civil War relic and definitely not some drunk redneck that shot at a tree because it resembled his ex-wife. I know not everybody works with slabs every day like I do, but this wood at this point was starting to get me pretty excited. It was really genuinely some of the nicest wood I've ever even seen, and once you run it through that planer, you can really start to see how the colors and the figure are coming out. And there was, I don't want to say a problem, but an issue that I needed to address with this one. This had this big natural void, and it's going to be on the underside, but it was right where the table base was going to be mounted, so I didn't want to have bolts running right into that epoxy. Probably could have gotten away with it, but I think this is going to be a much better long-term solution. This big void is a situation, like I mentioned earlier, that I don't really have control over. I can't control where there's a big bark inclusion or a knot hole, and when I first started taking commissions, one of my first big orders was from an interior designer, and I had done a horrible job managing her expectations leading into it. And so as I got the wood surfaced, I showed her some knot holes, and she just told me, I don't like those, they shouldn't be there. And I didn't know what to tell her. I was like, okay, let me do my best to remove this knot hole. And that's my fault because I did not manage her expectations. I did not tell her that this is a natural product. There's going to be things that come up, some things that are even man-made that are unexpected, like that bullet. We just have to do our best to work around them and to work with them. And that's what I'm doing here, is I'm essentially making a big solid wood inlay so I have a perfectly secure mounting point for the table base. A few months ago, I tried my hand at doing my very first patchwork table, and I think the patchwork design is super cool. A lot of people don't like it, and I think that's fine because it is a very unique style. But that's essentially what I'm trying to do here. Even though this is on the underside of the table, everything I learned here was from doing that patchwork table. And what I do is I cut this large recess, and there's always a bunch of little spots I miss with the router, so it's usually quicker for me to come back with the chisel and just clean them up here. I do need to square the corners off because the method that I use needs nice sharp corners, so I cut everything to a perfect 90, and then I use my table saw to trim it down to the exact size. And this really only works if you have a very accurate table saw, so I'd make a few cuts, and I could see there it's just barely wedges in there, and then I use my miter saw to cut the other edge, and now I'm just hoping it's snug but not too tight. But you really only get one chance at this, so you have to get it just right. And I felt like I had it about right there. And when you're doing an inlay like this, it's always useful if you can have a slight chamfer or bevel on the underside. And this was such a big piece, I decided to use my 45-degree router bit. And this will, one, enable it to go in a little bit easier, but two, give the glue somewhere to go when you put it in. You guys probably don't realize that there is a lot of footage that goes into these videos for this 3-table package. We had about 8.5 hours of footage, and I'm always trying to work on getting more efficient because I actually keep all my footage forever. But occasionally I'm reminded why we record so much material, and here's a good example of it.
Sound is, yep, sound is on. All right, what is first?
Gonna smooth out the big patch with the belt sander. After that, we'll put second tip. Were you actually rolling for that?
I was, yeah.
Disengaged. All right, let's try this again. So we're gonna get this. Let's try this patch first and just see how it looks. Besides that little belt sander drag race we had there, everything actually went exactly as I was hoping. It sat just proud enough, but not too proud that it was a big nightmare to flatten. Only took maybe 5 minutes or so to smooth it out. And this is exactly what I was hoping for, a nice, solid, smooth surface to mount the table base to. I've mentioned a couple times that a lot of this woodworking is out of our control. We can't control things like cracks and knots, not always. However, we can take some steps to give us a little bit better of a chance when it comes to working with those. And one of the best tips I can give you is building these tables slightly oversized to begin with, because that gives us the flexibility to work around some of these natural defects. And there's a really good example coming up, because here I'm cutting off the end grain and it looks fine. However, on the bigger table, we had some problems and I was glad I built it oversized. So I have the first tough choice to make on this big slab table here. I had all my measurements just perfect and it was gonna actually line up exactly how I'd imagined, but I got this cut and there's a ton of checks, meaning there's a ton of cracks on this end grain. And it's not uncommon, but I wasn't expecting this many. And so I can cut more off this, but then if I do that, there could still be cracks, and now I'm making that other end have less margin for error. So I don't know exactly what to do. I'm gonna probably stare at this for another 15 minutes or so. Well, I think I made the right decision. I got rid of a ton of the checks over here. I got the big cracks, which I knew those were gonna stay. Couple small ones left here, but feel good about the decision. I really like the look of this 22.5 degree chamfer on the underside of my tables. I've done it for years and I've continued to evolve exactly how I've done it. I used to do it like this with the track saw, where I would overlap that track just slightly. But the problem is, it's very, very hard to line up each corner. If it's off just by, I'd say a millimeter, but 1/10 of a millimeter, those corners won't line up perfectly. And here's where I'm joining those two. You can see that one was off just a little bit. So to combat this, I bought this big oversized router bit a few months ago that's a little bit dangerous to use, and that does work well and very accurately, but it takes so many passes and makes such a giant mess that it really isn't practical for making these huge chamfers. So finally, I've learned to combine these two methods, where I make that first cut with a track saw, remove about 95% of it, and then I just go through with this oversized router bit and make one final shallow pass, and that leaves a perfect corner. Some of you have probably noticed something about this video that's a little bit different than most of my past videos, and that is that everything is actually going pretty well so far. And other than my belt sander long jump competition, I haven't really had any major problems. This dining table is shaping up exactly as I was hoping it would. I haven't blown up any router bushings. Doing the edge profile on this desk, everything was looking good. Everything until I got to do the edge profile on the console table. Then we ran into the problem. I feel like sometimes I tend to be a little dramatic when I'm talking about these problems I have with these tables. This is not going very well. Kind of panicking right now, and I feel like I might actually puke. They're all genuine concerns and genuine problems, but I'm gonna try not to overdo this one, but it really isn't good. Basically, this wood is twisted on me, so it's not just got a little bit of a bow in it, it's got a twist, and I think the only thing I can do from here is actually take it in and get it CNC'd and resurfaced, and then hopefully it'll stay flat after that, but not great. This is another good reason why it's important to keep your pieces as large as possible, as long as possible. And that's not just the length and the width, but also the thickness, because if I had said I wanted it surfaced right down to that 1.75 inches from the beginning, and then I got a twist in it, I wouldn't have enough wood left over to get a nice looking table and have it be perfectly flat. However, I'd left this one a little bit thicker. I like the look of it, but it also gave me the flexibility to come back now, fix this twist with the CNC, run it through their wide belt sander, and I still have a 1.75 inch table and it's perfectly flat now. I really want to thank Aaron and Jordan over at Gobi Walnut for getting me in so quickly. I had this problem come up. I reached out and said, hey, can we get into the CNC? Normally CNC appointments take like a couple of weeks to get, and they got me in I think the same day or maybe even the next day for a quick flattening, and really meant a lot to me and saved me because I did not have weeks to spare on this project. And now I was able to get it home, get this round over, continue my edge profile. No chamfer on that one, but I did have some holes that needed to be filled, and this is kind of fun, but it can be a real challenge too.
So I just realized something, Scott.
What's that?
I'm colorblind.
Oh.
Can you help me with this?
Yeah, I think that one's a little more red than that one.
What about these?
Like that.
Hold on, I got an idea. I'm on the camera, you're
I'd say like right about that spot
here?
Yeah.
Kind of the same?
Yeah, kind of the same area in here.
I don't know why I'm the one looking at this, Scott. Are these where they should be?
I think so.
All right.
This method to fill small holes is really fun and kind of challenging and a new skill to learn, but I actually found a better way to do it, but it doesn't work for every single hole, and I'll show you that method here in a couple minutes. But for now, all I'm doing is making a toothpick that runs across the grain, essentially, so it can hopefully keep the grain running the right direction and get a nice snug fit there. And this is always a bit of a challenge. I've done this before. Sometimes they break, sometimes they don't, and sometimes the wood just doesn't look as good as I thought it would.
Think it's gonna break?
This one I think you'll be good.
How about that one?
That one I think will break.
Ah.
This is that better method for filling a hole that I mentioned earlier. This is called a plug cutter, and I used to use these a couple of years ago, but I haven't used it in a long time, and I realized I was actually using it incorrectly at first. What you want to do is you want to go all the way down like I do here, and that creates a nice slight taper, and that's kind of the magic of these plugs, because if you drill a 1/4 inch hole and it's off by 1/100 of an inch or so, this plug continues to taper, and so it'll just keep going down until you get that perfect fit. And it's really quite genius because no drill bit, no router bit are ever exactly what they say they are. It's not going to be exactly 0.25000. It's always going to be off by a little bit, and this plug makes up for that. I make a lot of jokes on this channel, and most of the time they're intentional. Most of the time I like antagonizing certain groups because it amuses me, and hopefully it amuses some of you out there too, like the incredibly sensitive Beatles fans or the anti-circumcision crowd that, despite their name, have incredibly thin skin. I am almost always intentionally antagonizing them because I think everybody can toughen up a little bit. However, in a recent video, I was talking about this drill press that I'm using, and I said that it was made in Taiwan, which is part of China, because I am legitimately an ignorant American and I did not know they were different. I looked it up, and Taiwan is named the Republic of China, and China is called the People's Republic of China, which are incredibly different things apparently, and I genuinely do apologize to anybody I offended there, because that was legitimately me just being dumb. And if anybody doesn't know why that was such a big mistake, apparently saying that Taiwan is part of China is just like saying that Ukraine is part of Russia, or telling someone from Houston that Texas is just another state. They're things that you just don't say. If I didn't mention it earlier and you're wondering why are there so many holes in the slab, these are all pins where they check the moisture content of these slabs that are drying, and since in that last video we had such a problem with the trapped moisture in the wood, they wanted to make extra sure the slab was extra dry, so there was more pins than there normally is, and I didn't love it, but I did love having perfectly dry wood that we knew was completely dry all the way through, so I was fine filling a few of these holes. And you can see they're not perfect. If you know where to look, you can find these, but they are about as good as I can do.
How'd they look on camera?
The one you just did looks really good. The other one that we did earlier,
You could see that one?
yeah.
We were gonna be all done. Do we redo that one?
Yes, I think so.
Man, always busting my balls.
The other ones just turned out so much better.
Okay, let's do it.
In the few years that I've been woodworking professionally, one of the things I've never regretted is taking the extra time to fix something that I knew I could do better. I've regretted not doing it plenty of times, but when you think, oh, this is gonna take me another 20 minutes, this will take me another hour, this will take me another day, you're never gonna regret spending that time, but you might look at a finished piece and realize, you know, I could have done better. I wish I would have just made it right. And I think this is a really good example of one of those pieces.
Well, I did my very best, but I know some of you are going to say, hey, I can see that dot from here. You did a horrible job. Well, guess what? This is a natural dot, the wood. These are the plugs that we filled that you didn't notice, so f*** off.
All right, apparently the Beatles fans aren't the only ones who can be sensitive. And anyway, I needed to find a way to fill these cracks on the end of the table, and I didn't want to just fill them aesthetically. I actually wanted that epoxy to soak down into them and really help hold them shut, because some of them went fairly deep and most of them weren't very wide. So I had to just kind of feather this epoxy down in and probably spend a good couple hours just coming back every so often and just trickling in a little bit more of this epoxy. And I did add some bow ties to the underside for a couple of the big cracks. Didn't show that in the video because basically just me adding a couple of bow ties, and we've all seen that too many times. But this epoxy I did feel like was pretty important to really spend the time and get it soaked down deep into those cracks. This piece had a sneaky number of tiny cracks. When you stand back and you look at it, it looks like a pretty solid piece, meaning not a lot of rot, not a lot of cracks, not a lot of knot holes. However, when you get up very close to it, there was a frightening number of these tiny little imperfections. So I spent much longer than usual doing these. This is the CA glue. I highly recommend this thick gel CA glue. It works a little bit better than the thin stuff, which tends to just soak down into the wood. And it is kind of a fun process for the first 5 minutes. The next 3 hours, not so much. They make a black CA glue that's a really nice color, but I feel like it's a little too thin and it ends up soaking into the wood and actually stains the wood. So what I do is I mix that black with that gel, and it makes kind of a medium thick version of that same black CA glue. Anytime I need to fill the holes that should stay black. Most of the time I just use clear, but I do like using the black when I'm touching up the actual epoxy itself. I continued to work on these 3 tables, and at this point in the project, I was pretty much sending them daily updates of what was happening, and I'm always very self-conscious of being the contractor from that episode of Seinfeld that kept bugging him every 5 minutes with a new question. So I always have a conversation before we start saying, hey, I can send you frequent updates, I can send you occasional updates, or I cannot send you any updates. And so far, pretty much everybody seems to say more updates. We want all the updates, and I feel like I would want updates too, but I'm really curious, would you guys actually want updates daily, or would that be too much? One of the nice things about having previously built all 3 of these tables is I already had all the legs and the table base just sitting around waiting to be installed. I was a little nervous having to store these for an extra 8 months in a relatively small shop. Didn't want to get them dinged or chipped or anything like that, but somehow they managed to stay in good shape. Just had to recess the mounting plates there, had a nice fit. This one I was terrified getting it up and down the stairs. I was so worried that we were going to chip that one or dent it. And this is a spider table base. This is made by Bryson Steel. He's made a few of these for me in the past. This is really one of my favorite table bases for any of the dining tables I use. We've all heard those slightly misleading statistics that say something to the effect of 95% of all automobile accidents occur within a half mile of home, so you need to be extra diligent for the entire drive. And those statistics never actually mention that most trips occur close to home. However, the point they're trying to make is it's easy to get complacent when you're almost done with something, and that definitely does apply to woodworking. And these threaded inserts are a perfect point of that, because it would be so easy to just kind of hurry this along and forget to set your depth. And I've had friends that have gotten to this point of the project, forget to set their depth on that thread insert and blow through the top of the table with that drill bit. So just a reminder, go all the way through the finish line. Pay attention until you're all the way in the garage. As I'm wetting this slab down, I'm getting a little bit of PTSD from that first debacle table build that had the 3 tables that were ruined from trapped moisture. And if you missed it earlier, I want to remind everybody that Wagner is giving away the 3 Orion 950, the $550 moisture meters, and I could have asked them for a bunch of money to plug their product. Instead, I asked them to give product away to you guys. So I hope you enjoy it, and I hope the 3 winners enjoy it as well. If you want details on that, there's a link in the video description below. Anybody who's built anything knows the pain of sanding. It is essentially the flossing of the woodworking world. It is so tedious. Nobody likes doing it. Everybody lies about how often they do it, but it is incredibly necessary. And I won't make you watch me floss this entire table. Instead, we can skip right to the good stuff, the finishing process. This piece of walnut was incredibly dense. It was very hard and very, very heavy, much more so than most black walnut pieces I work with. And in spite of this, it was very, very thirsty. It kept absorbing more and more finish. Every time I'd buff a little bit on, it would look almost instantly dry. And I don't necessarily see this as a bad thing. The more finish that gets absorbed into a piece of wood, the more protected it's going to be. But it was just very, very surprising. As I went along, you can see the top there looks almost completely dry. So kept adding more finish. You basically want to just saturate it, make it so the wood cannot accept any more finish. And after about 15 minutes, then you wipe off any excess. I wiped all the excess oil off the dining table, got that set aside, and got to work on the console table. And while I was doing these tables, I also refinished a set of coasters for these clients that I'm going to throw into the crate as just kind of a nice little surprise and a little bit of a thank you for them being so patient. And for the desk, I had an extra special guest. This is Eric G. He has a local home improvement show called Around the House with Eric G. And he asked if he could come film a segment. I said, I got to finish a desk. You want to watch that? And he's like, yeah, absolutely. So we talked shop while I finished this desk. And if you want any more information about him, I'll leave it in the video description as well. One of the silver linings to messing those first 3 tables up is if I would have finished those tables on schedule, that would have been before I had this N3 nano coating, and this is an absolute game changer for the woodworking world. This ups the contrast, this ups the sheen, but most importantly, it ups the protection. It's always the question everybody asks, how do I use this every day with my family? If they have kids, if they have spills, if they have rude guests, this is the way. I've been doing a ton of tests with it. I was recently doing a water test where I had a side-by-side comparison of just Rubio versus Rubio with the N3, and the water wouldn't even flow over to the side with the N3. It was a really kind of a trippy effect, and it's pretty simple to put on. I do have a how-to video over on my other channel, Blacktail Studio Uncut, and it's something I think is going to change the way we finish wood going forward. So here is the dining table first. This is some of the prettiest wood I've ever seen. I've never seen gray tones like this in walnut.
It's amazing.
It's beautiful.
Here is the bullet for the Europeans.
Oh, that looks fantastic.
Oh, it looks
Ken.
amazing. Yeah, and that table has so much detail in it. That wood is just, God, that's just, amazing.
So here is the desk. I don't know if you remember what base you requested because it's been so long.
I do. It looks great.
And this wood is from the same tree, but it doesn't have the gray in it, but it's got just a crazy amount of color and figure.
Yeah.
No, I love the flow of that. That's beautiful.
Also, I had this piece, I built it for kind of a weird reason. And if you are interested in it, I would love to include this at no cost, just for you guys being such good sports. It's an end table.
Oh yeah, your waterfall end table. Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful.
So if you'd like me to include this in the crate, I'd be happy to.
I love it.
Yes, please.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Yes.
All right, the last one, your console table here, the biggest struggle of all 3 tables, at least this revision of all 3 tables. And it's hard to compare anything to the dining table, but I really like how this one turned out.
I love it though.
Yeah, it looks beautiful. Yeah.
Are you ready for them?
Yes, sir.
Well, I applaud your patience.
We applaud your work.
Yes.
Thank you guys again, and I'll be in touch.
All right.
All right. Thanks for the update again.
Thank you.
Ready to go? Sweet.
Everything's in there. The end table,
End table's in there.
the leg levelers,
Leg levelers in there.
maintenance spray.
I almost forgot. We're offering an N3 maintenance spray that is a monthly refresh to keep your N3 finished products looking new forever.
Done. Got the coasters.
The overseas shipping process was an ordeal in itself, but after several months, eventually these crates with the coasters inside arrived safely. Everything looks great, is unpacked, and currently in their houses and hopefully their forever homes. And the next wood species I'm going to show you is, I feel, the most underrated wood species of everything I've shown you. It's called elm, but I think that is part of the problem, that we don't have a good enough name for it, and I go into a little bit more on that later. This desk is essentially going to be a big single slab solid wood desk with kind of a hybrid live edge aspect to it. And since I'm not creative enough to visualize exactly what it would look like or smart enough to use software to help me render it, I build these simple little templates to really just help me visualize what it's going to look like when it's all done. And I mentioned this is going to be oversized, so this will be around 72 by I think 34 inches when it's all said and done. But the slab, as you can see, is much bigger than that. So we actually have a little bit of freedom choose exactly the best part we want to use for this desk. Anytime that I remove the live edge of a big wood slab like this, I get tons of comments from people that tell me that I just ruined the look of this big natural wood slab by removing that live edge. Conversely, anytime I make a live edge table, I get tons of comments from people that tell me that live edge is going to be a really dated style and I just made a very tacky table. And finally, anytime I add epoxy to anything, both sides like to pile on and tell me that I just ruined it by adding toxic chemicals to the natural wood. So I wanted to give a table for all sides to come together and hate in one place. So this is going to have straight edge, live edge, and a little bit of epoxy. I mentioned that I felt this was a very underrated wood, and the species that I'm using here is elm. And I think part of the problem with the image of elm is it's a very boring sounding name. It's like being named Bob, and you don't see any male models named Bob. They're always named Fabio or something. And the same for wood species. You're named Bubinga or Rosewood or Bastogne Walnut. They all have a very fancy name, but elm, it just sounds so boring. So I think we need to work on rebranding it. We need to come up with a new name for elm that still would apply. It's like the sea bass used to be named the Patagonian toothfish, which is a ridiculous name and nobody would eat it. But as soon as they rebranded it sea bass, it's at every restaurant. So if we can come up with a better name for elm, I think that would really help the image. I should say this isn't just ordinary elm. This is elm that has a good bit of burl to it. And the burl is where you get the most amazing grain, the most amazing color. It's just kind of a pain to clean up, whereas these normal live edge sections are really easy to clean up with something like this Porter Cable Restorer. But the burl sections are where you have to get really creative with all your dental tools and dull chisels and try to dig it out while still maintaining the natural shape of these kind of crags. This isn't going to be an epoxy table, so to speak, but there is a rather large, rather noticeable, rather in the way, but really cool natural crack that runs about a quarter of the length of the table. And so what I'm doing here is I am sealing it with clear epoxy because we're going to be filling that void with a jet black epoxy, and the clear is going to prevent any staining on this light wood from that black epoxy. And also a question I get all the time is, why do I always use black epoxy? Why don't I try to match the wood color a little bit more closely? And in my opinion, black is actually the most discreet color you can use because a lot of these woods have really natural black streaks in them. And also it kind of resembles more of just a shadow than anything. So if you want a really discreet void filled, I recommend using black epoxy. In the past, I've had good luck sealing small cracks like this with this Gorilla Tape or a good quality duct tape. The only thing you need to remember is the epoxy needs to be relatively dry. So I'll come back and do those later. As far as the top, I rarely do this caulk trick, but I am doing it here because I want to maximize the thickness of this slab. So this is going to allow me to overpour that epoxy slightly without it running all over the table. This crack that I'm filling isn't very wide, but it's pretty deep. These slabs are about 2 1/4 inches thick right here, and with that overfill, we're probably close to 2 1/2 inches. So instead of using something like a tabletop epoxy, I'm using the super clear epoxy deep pour resin. And this is going to do a couple things. This is first off going to allow me to pour the entire crack in one shot, so I don't have to come back and do layers. Second, it's going to really, really reduce the bubbles. It's going to be essentially a perfectly clear pour, whereas if I did the tabletop epoxy, there's always going to be little micro bubbles that'll need addressing. Speaking of my friends/sponsors over at Super Clear Epoxy, I have started the wildly premature process of planning for my 1,000,000 subscriber giveaway, which, first of all, is absolutely preposterous to think that I would have ever got to this point. So thank you all so much for coming along for the journey. I genuinely never, ever thought this was remotely possible. So everybody out there that subscribed, thank you guys so much for coming along for the journey. As for the rest of you freeloaders, you guys are cool too. I do appreciate the views anyway, but I wanted to do something pretty big for my 1,000,000 subscriber giveaway. So one of the things Super Clear Epoxy is donating is like a $2,200 epoxy package that we'll give away to several winners. I'm going to be making furniture to donate. I'm going to be donating my consultations. Oliver is donating a spiral head benchtop planer. Gobi Walnut's going to be donating a wood slab. We're going to have even more sponsors. So I will include a link to my email sign up. I do not know all the specifics of how I'm going to do this giveaway. So if you sign up for the email list, I will send you all the details as I learn them. After I removed as much of this caulk as I could and let it cure for a couple of weeks, I was ready to take it into my favorite industrial shop in Portland, Creative Woodworking Northwest. And here's a little tip for you. When you start handling these pieces, especially after they get surfaced, keep them on one of these styrofoam sheets from Home Depot. They only cost like $7, and they'll really prevent any dings or dents you might get. When you pull into Creative Woodworking, it's kind of a free-for-all because there's no dedicated unloading zone. Both of us here are actually parked in a no parking zone, and since we got here at the same time, I helped him offload his stuff so that way I could get the cart up to the back of my truck to offload my slab. However, at this point, he realized he locked the keys in the truck, so he actually couldn't get in there. So we were kind of stuck, so I had to make do, and luckily I didn't have any bigger table than I do this week because this is about all I could carry by myself. The guys at Creative Woodworking are super easy to work with, and they only charge $75 for 30 minutes or $150 per hour to use all of these incredible tools. The only thing they say is don't run any metal through the tools, and you can see there Thor hit the emergency stop and fished out what looks to be a little piece of aluminum. It's like a little aluminum cap, and I didn't recognize it. I'm going to blame it on someone else, but Thor gave me the disappointed look there because it might have been mine. But either way, Thor caught it, and I didn't get charged the $150 fee if they happen to hit metal in one of your projects. A few weeks ago, I drew a fair amount of attention to a certain part of a desk that resembled a certain part of the female anatomy, and got a fair amount of comments of people telling me how embarrassed I should be and how juvenile I was, and I can assure you that will never happen again. Normally, I just square things up when I get home from Creative Woodworking with my track saw, but because they have a 30-minute minimum and we only spend about 10 or 15 minutes on the planer, I went over to the Martin sliding table saw and squared everything up because they could do it in about 3 minutes, and it is just as good as anything I could do with my track saw at home. Probably even better. Whatever table I'm building, whether it's a big epoxy table or a single slab desk like this or a solid wood book match like I've done in the past, as soon as I get it surfaced, I like to get it home and start on the C-channel process to give it as little opportunity as possible for it to warp and cup on me. And there's a few reasons why they don't traditionally build out of these big single slabs like this. They're actually one of the worst ways to build a table. People think this is the easiest way, and there are aspects of it that are easy, but it lends itself to problems down the road if you don't take certain precautions. And one of those precautions is doing something like these C-channels. And always I get asked, what do the C-channels do? Will they prevent it from cracking or splitting or all these questions? And all they really do is they help keep it flat, whereas a traditional table is generally made from a number of boards glued up in a particular grain orientation that will help assist in keeping that table flat. Also, most tables have something called an apron, so that will also assist in keeping it flat. These single slabs or the book match or the live edge tables, they don't really have any of that. So these C-channels assist in keeping it flat the same way that apron does or that grain orientation in the glue up. I need to be really careful and stop talking about panel glue ups at this point because I'm sure I'm going to say the wrong thing if I keep going because those really aren't my wheelhouse. I know a little bit about them. I've done some of them, but if I was going to do one right now, I'd probably get on YouTube and look up something like the Wood Whisperer, and I actually know he has a good video on that. So I'll include a link to his video in the description below if you want some more information on a traditional panel glue up. When I used to recess these mounting plates for my table bases, I used to build a jig for each and every table base. And then I realized that was a complete waste of time. So what I do now is I put my table leg exactly where I want it. And then I just surround it with this 1/4 inch melamine or acrylic or both. And I fasten it down with double side tape. And I give myself about a 1/4 inch buffer all around. And this allows me enough room for the seasonal wood movement of the slab to move around that table base. Because you don't really want it locked in place and just a perfect CNC fit, because that could actually cause your wood to crack over time. I mentioned this in my last video, but apparently not everybody that watches one video of yours watches every single video that you make. So I'll mention it again. And that's when you're done working on your table, before you finish it, cover it with something like this painter's plastic, because that's going to prevent one side from absorbing moisture from the air and causing it to warp or twist a little bit. After you have finished on both sides, then you don't need to do it. But before that, I like to cover it with the plastic pretty much every single night that I'm done using it. I never like to ask for a subscription in the first part of a video, because I feel like even if I was able to trick someone into hitting subscribe in that first minute, there's a really good chance that those same people would be unsubscribed by the time they got to like minute 2 and they realized they don't like me talking this much. So if you've been able to make it to minute 10 with me talking the entire time, I think you're ready. I think you should just hit that subscribe button. If you actually think that I've earned it, I would appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button right now. It genuinely does help me out. And like I mentioned earlier, we're doing the 1,000,000 subscriber giveaway if I do actually hit it, which I should by the end of the year, hopefully, cross my fingers. So if you want to be a part of that, I would really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button right now. This slab did have quite a few cracks in it, but the only one I was really worried about was this one right near the end. And so I'm adding a single solitary bow tie, and this is going to be on the underside. I don't think there'd be anything wrong aesthetically is putting these bow ties on top of the desk, but I think this was going to be a little bit cleaner, and I got the feeling my client really wanted a nice, clean, smooth, single slab top with no inlays or bow ties. And I know a lot of you guys out there agree, because I got a lot of comments of people asking me, why can't you put bow ties on the underside? And the question is, you absolutely can. Some people just like the looks of them on top. So this one's going to be in the underside. I'm using epoxy here. There's no real reason not to use wood glue. I do think the epoxy works a little bit better when you're doing something that isn't clamped, but wood glue would have worked just as well. In my last video, I mentioned I've been working on better ways to clean up my live edge without really marring the surface. And these nylon brushes actually work really well. They're pretty cheap. I think they're from Amazon. I'll include a link to them in the description below. But a lot of you guys actually had some really good ideas. I had never even heard of dry ice blasting, which sounds awesome. And it also sounds really expensive. But if you watch my videos, you know I'm not adverse to expensive. So thanks to everybody and their ideas for helping me clean up my live edge. One of the most frustrating parts of working with epoxy is filling these little micro pits. You can see there, I filled them the best I possibly could with CA glue, hit them with the sander, and then they come back. And this is what always happens. It's so frustrating. So I do have a solution for you. It's a little counterintuitive, and that's actually to make the holes bigger, because what happens is those little pits kind of form an air pocket and they won't allow that CA glue to penetrate. So I carve out a little groove and then I fill them with just regular clear CA glue, and believe it or not, the clear actually matches the black just perfectly. Then hit it with the sander and those micro bubbles will disappear finally. I just watched that Bob Ross documentary on Netflix, and I never knew that he did those paintings in real time. So if it was a 28-minute episode, he did the entire painting start to finish in less than 28 minutes, which is absolutely unbelievable. And the reason I bring this up is I wanted to show you guys a few clips of just how much time this takes me. This is not Bob Ross time. This is highly, highly edited. This takes me hours, if not days, just to fill these imperfections and sand it. I wish I could do it in 30 minutes. I'm not that good. Maybe I will be someday. But for now, I want you guys to know that if your project takes you hours or days, that's not unusual. This is normal. This is at least normal for me, and not all of us can be Bob Ross. My sanding progression starts at 100, then I go to 120, 150, and I end at 180 grit. And in between each and every grit, I spritz with water, or quote, water pop it to help raise the grain, which in theory gives you a smoother finish in the end. And I haven't done the scientific tests on that, so I can't say for sure, but I do feel like it makes a difference. And from there, then I can start my actual finishing process. If you are interested in becoming a better wood finisher, a few months ago, I decided to create my own finishing workshop. And my original plan was I was going to charge for it. I figured I could charge, $49.95 for this hour-and-a-half long class. And eventually I just decided to give it away. So right now it is completely free. I don't want to say I'll never charge for it, but for now, everything is free and there is no bait and switch. It's not like you sign up and then once you get to chapter 2, make you put your credit card in for the rest of it. If you sign up now, it will be free forever. And it is a very detailed workshop. And the reason I didn't just put it on YouTube is some of the details are probably a little too boring to keep someone engaged for that full hour-and-a-half long workshop. It goes through every step from the sanding to applying the finish to applying the N3 Nano, everything in there to get an essentially perfect wood finish, even in a dusty shop or garage. Because I feel like what is the fun or what's the usefulness in having a finishing workshop if you need a big spray booth and all this expensive equipment? All you really need is something to wipe it on and something to wipe it off. And there's a little bit more to it, but there's a link in the description if you want to learn more about that free finishing workshop. I did a quick test fit of these legs by Flowy Line Design before I got it packed up for delivery. And I mentioned at the start of the video that elm is occasionally affordable. And what I meant by that was it wasn't particularly affordable here, but it really wasn't that bad either. I paid $1,350 for that slab, which is kind of a fair retail price. It's just not a steal. Whereas I feel like keep your eyes peeled, sometimes you can get something like elm for a little bit cheaper. Also, the finished cost of this desk was $6,500, which was a little bit less than I normally do, but they also ordered a dining table from me at the same time that's coming in hopefully just a few weeks. So I'll have a video on that as well. Here we go though. Here is the finished elm. I really, really like elm. I love the light color. I love that burl corner. I like the crack. I like that I didn't use any bow ties for once. So all in all, I'm really, really thrilled with it. Like a lot of you out there, I tend to hoard wood. I bought this piece of maple about 4 or 5 years ago on Craigslist. I actually bought 2 of them. They're about the same size for $15 a piece. And I thought it was a pretty good deal. And it's a really cool piece of wood. It has a lot of figure in it. And it's pretty big, about 4 inches by 6 inches. So I kept putting off using it. I kept saying I was going to save it for the perfect project. And no, I can't use it for this. I can't use it for this. So finally here, I just decided it was time to use some of the wood that I already had. And since it didn't cost much money and I wasn't sure how well this was going to turn out, thought it was a perfect candidate. Some of you might have seen these amazing bandsaw artists that can cut these crazy reindeer and have them look amazing right off the bandsaw. You can probably tell already that I am not that bandsaw artist. Most of this is going to be made up for with the power carving later, so I am just doing the best I can with that thick resaw blade that I have on there. And it's a good blade for resawing. It's not a good blade for these complex shapes. The base that I'm going to use for this table is about a 2-inch silver maple slab, and this slab was about $20, so we are up to about $35 for the total cost of this project. However, I'm not using the whole slab, so I'll be able to use more of this for another table later. But it is nice to use the oversized stuff, and this is 2 inches, and it's not going to look like a 2-inch slab when it's done, but that is one of the things that makes this power carving so cool, is that you get to really kind of contour the shapes down into it. So a pretty thin base actually needs to start fairly thick. A lot of people ask me about this jig that I use on my bandsaw, and it's actually a really cheap and easy jig to make. And I just got on YouTube, looked up a couple different designs, and landed on one that I liked. And a lot of you ask if I will make a video showing how to make this jig so then they can make the same jig for their bandsaw at home. And first of all, I didn't invent this jig, and second of all, I didn't improve on it. So I don't really feel like I'm worthy to make a whole video about this bandsaw jig, since I would basically just be ripping someone else off. So what I will do is I will look through YouTube and I'll try to find the same video that I watched to learn how to make this jig, add a link in the description so then you guys can make the same jig if you want for your own bandsaw. For the actual shaping of the table base, I'm going to be using these Kutzall carving discs. And some of you know that Kutzall has been a longtime supporter of my channel. They are really cool to work with. When I have an idea for a video, I don't have to deal with some media firm. I literally call the owner. He answers. He also manages their Instagram account. They are great to work with. They are like a 3rd generation family-owned company. All of these discs are apparently even handmade, and I found that hard to believe. I asked him if I could have some videos, and he said that would give away their secrets of how they do it. But essentially, they are these tungsten carbide teeth that essentially never get dull, and of course, everything has to get dull eventually, but I haven't had any of these get dull yet. So they are these really amazing discs. They cost like $60 a piece, so you can be all set up and into power carving for the cost of an angle grinder plus $60. So really cool tool, and really just a great company to work with. These discs do kick up a lot of dust, so even though I was doing this in my shop to start, I found they work much, much better outside. Make sure you wear a respirator, make sure you wear goggles, all of those things. However, these Carving discs aren't as intimidating as they look. You'll feel it out pretty quick once you get started carving, and don't do anything you're not comfortable with. However, you will pick it up pretty quick. Kutzall doesn't just make those shaping discs, they have a whole line of carving tools. This is their ball nose burr, and I have just recently got this electric die grinder, and it works really great. I was using an air-powered one before, but I highly recommend getting the electric one. It never runs out of air, has plenty of power. So a really cool tool and another cool carving tool that I can use. But eventually I didn't really like the way this was going. I didn't care for the shape. It started to look like a flamingo with too many knee joints. So what I had to do was I had to smooth it out somehow. And I ended up using that same ball nose burr to kind of flatten out the sides more like a snake's scales. And I don't particularly love the look of a snake. However, it was going to make this much more interesting and less flamingo-like. As much as I've always wished I was an amazing artist, I know that I just don't have that gene in me. I can't paint a picture, I can't create an original shape, but what I've done in the past, because I know I have this handicap, is I look to nature for inspiration. I've done that a lot with my epoxy tables, and that's what I've done here. And I feel like even if you don't like snakes, you can still respect the amazing shape that nature has given them, because they did it over millions of years, and it's hard to improve on what nature has done. So I used it for inspiration. I think it worked pretty well here. I didn't want to go too on the nose. I didn't want to put a big cobra-shaped tabletop on this. I just wanted to use some of that amazing organic shape as inspiration, and then kind of make the rest my own. During the shaping process, I made sure to look at it from all different sides, because you don't want something that looks really cool from one side and then you go 90 degrees and it looks ridiculous, because if this is going to be in your house, you want it to look good from essentially all sides, at least 3 sides, I'd say. So once I liked the shape of it, I moved on to my oscillating tool with the 80 grit. And the 80 grit is a really good bridge from the finish sanding to the shaping. Whereas if you have a lump, if you have a spot that you don't quite like, you can still smooth it out with the 80 grit, but you don't risk going too far like you could with one of those carving discs. At this point, I was finally ready to bring the project back inside, which is good because we do not get that many sunny days during an Oregon winter. And what I'm using here are a couple really cool tools. One of them is the Kutzall rasp. The other is a vacuum clamp. And if you don't know, a vacuum clamp is exactly what it sounds like. It's essentially a suction cup for woodworking. It is a vacuum powered clamp that holds onto whatever you put on there, and it doesn't even need to be that smooth. It's actually a pretty amazing tool. It is also pretty expensive. It's like $1,300 some for the pair of them. That sander I was using there is like $500, and I mentioned that this can be a really cool way to get into woodworking for cheap. This is not a good example of that. If you want to get into woodworking for cheap, stay away from the blue and green tools. They are a horrible idea, but they are really, really nice. Just like any project, there was a lot of sanding, and just like any project, it is super boring to watch. It was essentially like watching someone else play video games, only I had just learned that people actually pay to watch other people play video games now, so maybe I need to start a Twitch channel where you guys can pay to watch me sand wood, because I think that would be just about as exciting as the video game thing. Also, this turned out to be a really bad idea, so don't leave just yet if you're on the fence, because I made a pretty huge mistake. Just stay tuned. Do you ever look over and see a coworker doing something really stupid and be like, oh my God, I can't believe you almost did that. You are so lucky I am here. Or maybe you've been that coworker where someone's like, wow, I can't believe you almost did that. This was a really bad idea. So I don't have any coworkers. I am the only one looking over my shoulder. And so this is what happens when you have no coworkers. I would try to defend that idea, but it was just a genuinely bad idea. And my YouTube guardian angels will be delighted to know that I was wearing closed-toed shoes and safety glasses during that whole process, so I at least have that going for me. And in the end, I was able to mark a line that was perfectly parallel with the bottom and then make that cut with this Japanese pole saw. So ended up with a table that's about an inch shorter. It's not for a client, it's just for my house. So not a devastating blow in the end, but certainly not something I was trying to do. A few videos back, I pointed out that the wood turners use this trick where they hollow out the center section, which means just that outer ring sits on the floor, which means it will sit much, much flatter. And someone in the comments pointed out that it's not just wood turners who do that. It's basically everybody does that. Soda manufacturers, cereal bowls, everybody makes things that have just the outer ring that sits on the ground. So if you are going to do a similar project, make sure that you kind of concave that center section and it will sit much, much better. Speaking of YouTube comments, every week I have this little call to action at the end of the videos, and a few weeks back I told people to say their favorite band, and the first person that had the same favorite band as me, I would give a call out in a future video. So big credit to Matthew Potter, who had the very first correct answer, and he was not the last correct answer, but the correct answer was obviously Led Zeppelin. How does anybody have another favorite band? So thanks to everybody that played along with that game, and big credit to Matthew Potter. If you're wondering why I'm not giving a detailed tutorial on how to apply this finish, it's because I actually end up sanding off this finish here in a little bit, but I wanted to show you what it looked like and tell you why I sanded it off. And I'll get into the reasons of exactly why I took it off later, but for now I am using CLSL, wipe it on and wipe it off. It is a finish I've used before and I normally like it. It just was a little too orange on this maple. All right, onto the tabletop. And this might not look like much, but it's actually some of the nicest wood in my entire collection. This is some highly figured curly and spalted maple. And I'm sure a lot of you guys already know this, but curly maple does not come from a curly maple tree. The curl are those linear kind of tiger lines. You'll hear it called tiger maple or fiddleback maple. Those are all kind of variations on the figure. Spalted maple also does not come from a spalted maple tree. The spalting is those dark black lines, and those are actually a fungus that comes from the tree beginning to rot after the tree's been cut. So once the tree is dead, they leave it intentionally for a while to induce that spalting, trying to make it so it doesn't get too rotted, but still getting enough of those cool black lines. I believe I spent about $20 on this board a couple of years ago, and I think that brings our total up to $55, and I know I told you $40 total, but I didn't use the entire slab, I didn't use this entire board, so I'm going to round down, but we're going to be somewhere between the $40 and $55. So apparently this knot hole resembles another kind of hole, and I do get a lot of trolls, but that doesn't always mean they're all wrong, and I had posted a video of this on Instagram, and I hadn't even really noticed it, but I got some very interesting comments from people. And this next little bit might make some of you a little uncomfortable, so feel free to look away. But instead of trying to hide this hole, I decided to kind of lean into it and just make it a little bit more artistic, make it a little more interesting looking. And I had some more of these cut saw die grinding tools, and I used this kind of thin one with the extreme grit to auger out most of it. And again, I wasn't trying to hide the fact that there's a hole. I was just trying to make it look a little bit better and a little less like the thing that it kind of looked like. This is one of their flame bits in the fine grit, and you can get really close to kind of a sandpaper finish with this fine grit if you go nice and slow and keep the speed good. And then the last thing I had to do was just use this Dremel tool to kind of smooth it out and clean it up a little bit. I definitely don't need any more comments whether or not you think that hole looked like what it definitely did look like, but what I would like some feedback on is whether or not you think I should have left it natural, so to speak, or if I should have done what I did by hollowing it out and kind of embracing the void there. I mentioned I didn't like how yellow that CLSL turned the maple, which is common of any oil-based finish, so I went back to a tried and true finish of mine, and that is the Osmo 3043. It's not the best protection, but it might be the prettiest finish that I use. So I did about 2 or 3 coats of this Osmo 3043, and it provided a great non-yellowing finish. I always like to wait at least a day before I take my wood out of the clamps, and this one was ready to go the next day. So pulled it out of the clamps, got it on my circle jig, the same one that I used for that base, cut it out to the proper diameter. Again, I kind of undershot it, so I had to make a second cut where I was able to trim it right down to size. And this spalted maple can be really tricky to work with because those spalted areas are so rotted and therefore so soft that first thing I want to do was get them on my drum sander. And I don't love using a drum sander. It's just a slow tool to use, but it does get it very flat and consistent because hand sanding can be very hard with the spalted maple. Second, I went on to my router table and I got a new 60-degree chamfer bit or bevel bit, whatever you want to call it. And I did take quite a few passes before I got up to this point because it is a pretty big bit and I don't have a huge router in there. So I had to make nice, slow, shallow passes so I didn't either have tear out or burn it. And then I was left with a slight little lip, able to take that down with my little mini block plane. And now I was finally ready for finish. Finishing spalted maple can be really, really tricky as well because it's so soft that it needs a finish that's going to harden. You can't put something like the Osmo on here or the Rubio because that doesn't get really hard. So you need something like a varnish or a lacquer, but the problem is most urethanes and varnishes, all the oil-based ones, they're going to turn this spalted maple really dark and it really takes away from the whole effect of it. So I used a water-based finish. I'm going to try to have a whole video on this finish process because it was kind of experimental, and in the end it worked really well, but the key is to use a water-based finish. At this time, I wasn't positive I was going to keep this top with this base permanently, so I wanted to make kind of a mounting plate that could interchange some different tops. So that's why I didn't recess this top into that circle, and I may eventually do that if I'm 100% sure that I'm going to keep this top with that base. But for now, it was a pretty simple mounting solution that actually worked really well. If you want to know how I got this really cool dramatic shot, I had my iPhone in ultra wide mode. I had a black backdrop up, put a bunch of photography light on this, and then just panned that phone back, and that is how it looked. And that photography backdrop, it doesn't look great in person. You would be very surprised to see that this is what I looked like, but this is what it looks like on my camera when I'm taking the photos. So it is really cool when you get your settings right because everything just clicks. And these are how the photos ended up. And I'm pretty proud of these photos. I thought they looked pretty dramatic. I loved how this finish turned out. Again, I'm hoping to have a full finish video on that eventually. I just want to make sure that I actually know what I'm doing so I can teach you guys the proper way first. And again, there's that curl, those linear lines, all that spalting, just a really remarkable piece of wood in the end. The last wood species I'm going to show you is Claro walnut, which is a little different than the Bastogne walnut I showed you earlier. Bastogne is actually a hybrid between the Claro and the English walnut, and can all get a little bit confusing, but generally Claro and Bastogne walnut are considered the most beautiful of all the walnut species. Hey, this is Cam with Blacktail Studio, and this week I'm going to take you through building a slab dining table from start to finish. And as you can see there, this is an incredible slab from Gobi Walnut. It would retail for $3,600. But they were cool enough to donate it for this COVID-19 food relief fundraiser we're doing, where I'm building the table, they're donating the wood. So it's really cool for them to collaborate on this because this would be the most expensive piece of wood that I had ever worked with, despite the fact that I didn't actually have to pay for this one. I was pretty open when we started this project on doing either a live edge or a square edge. And the way this slab was oriented, it actually seemed to make the most sense for me to leave just a little kiss of a live edge. And you'll see what I'm talking about here in a minute. Because right now I'm just cutting it square with my Festool track saw. And a lot of people ask why I make so many passes. And if you use a saw, you'll learn that they're a little bit underpowered. They're super accurate and a really nice tool to have. But to get a good clean cut, you have to make several passes like I'm doing here. If you decide to take on a slab table project like this, part of what you're paying for is the condition of the slab. And besides a couple small cracks, the slab was actually in remarkable shape. So I had to clean up a little bit in the cracks here on top and a couple more on the front. But other than that, it was a really, really solid slab, which made this build go really smooth. So $3,600 is a ton of money for a slab, but that's you're kind of paying for the time you're going to save and the work needed to make this a suitable table. As I mentioned, I didn't have the intention of going into this with keeping a small live edge piece, but in the end, it was actually probably my favorite part of the table. So I wanted to keep it really natural, and I went ahead and used a nylon wheel on my Porter cable restored just to clean it up, but leave it pretty natural. All the cracks I'm going to be filling with a black resin, but that black resin can actually seep in and stain the wood itself. So first I'm going to seal all of the cracks with a clear resin using this air compressor here to spray that clear resin down in there to really prevent any color bleed. If you decide to fill any cracks similar to how I'm going to do here, I will save you the trouble and do not use painter's tape. I've learned from experience, more often than not, it will leak right through it. Use that Tyvek tape, and I'll include links to everything I'm using in the video description below, so you guys can know exactly the tools and products that I used for this build. But I am using a fast drying epoxy here. This is a West system. It works really well. Cures in just a couple hours instead of like 3 days, like the deep pour resins I normally use. So it's a good, really, really hard, it's traditionally like a boat resin, and it will work perfectly for these cracks. A good tip anytime you're adding epoxy to wood is to brush it into the sides like you see me doing there, and that's just going to prevent a lot of those little bubbles from clinging to the sides. I have a full video on how I cut these bow ties and then another full video on how I inlay them. So I'll go over this pretty quick here. If you do want a more expanded explanation of how I do this, feel free to click on the link to that video in the video description below. I rarely do contrasting bow ties, like doing a light maple wood, for instance, with this walnut. I really try to use wood, not just walnut, but walnut from the same slab that I'm working on, because it's so hard to match the color just right. And if you used a walnut piece from a different slab, there's a really good chance it would stand out and not match the wood in your particular slab. So try to use a piece of wood from your slab if you want a nice, clean look to your table. The cool thing about this jig that I use is that it only takes about 2 minutes to make, and so you can make several different jigs for different looks that you want. You could have a steeper, more traditional looking bow tie, then you can have a more slender, modern looking bow tie, all with just a couple minutes work. If you were wondering how I was going to fill those gaps on top of the slab that you saw me clean up at the start of the video, this is the best way I could think of. And it wasn't perfect, but it actually worked pretty well. So I just put a little bit of that Tyvek tape on the back, and then I came back and it took me about 3 or 4 pours to fill it up completely with that fast drying resin. Oh, and if you decide to use this tape, you're gonna have to use heat to remove it. Otherwise it's a complete mess. It's still kind of a mess doing it this way, but it works a lot better than without it. I don't have a video out on adding these splines like I'm going to show you here in just a second. I probably wouldn't do this on the top of a table. It's not quite as precise as my hand-cut bow ties, but it works really well for securing some cracks that you just aren't sure enough and not having to spend all day hand-cutting bow ties. And all we are essentially doing is cutting a straight spline that we're going to put a straight piece of wood with epoxy in there. And some of you are probably thinking, how is that going to be as strong as a bow tie, since the bow tie kind of has that wedged mechanical joint? And the quick answer is it's not going to be as strong as a bow tie, but it will be pretty strong. And these cracks aren't really a high risk one that I'm worried about separating. This is the back side of the table, so I'm just adding them just to be a little bit more secure in knowing that the cracks aren't going to separate. Just make a little micro crack on that epoxy resin that I filled it with. The big advantage to doing them like this is that I can do about 6 of these in 30 minutes, where I generally spend about 30 minutes per individual bow tie that I cut. So using a 3/8 inch roundover bit there to match my 3/8 inch spiral bit that I cut them with, and they're gonna fit pretty good, but like I said, they're not perfect in there. They're not quite like a CNC fit. And if you are gonna do them like this, I do recommend epoxy, because that is gonna have a little bit more shear holding power than like a wood glue, since these aren't wedged in there with that mechanical holding force that a bow tie has. I let these dry overnight, came back with my belt sander. I think I had 80 grit, which is pretty aggressive, and I'd be a little bit more careful if I was going to do that on the top of the table, but this is by far the fastest way to smooth out any of these bow ties or splines. I thought that the square edge of the table looked a little bit boring, so I decided to go ahead and cut a 22-degree chamfer. And sometimes I call it a bevel incorrectly, and there's always some people quick to jump in to tell me in the comments that I incorrectly called it a bevel when technically it's a chamfer. So using my track saw to cut this 22-degree chamfer here, and it's just going to give it a little bit more interesting, a little bit more modern look. And using the track saw to cut this chamfer was something I actually had to do out of necessity a couple of videos ago, because I couldn't find a router bit big enough, and it ended up being a much better, much cheaper alternative than having to buy these huge industrial router bits. So what I did is I overlapped it about 1/4 of an inch, make sure that it was overlapped uniform the whole way, came through, cut my chamfer, and everything lined up just perfect. I get asked fairly often about inlaying these bow ties and what do you need, and do you need expensive chisels? And really the only answer is you need sharp chisels. And I'm using my Tormek here to sharpen up my blue spruce chisels. They are pretty nice, pretty expensive chisels. You really don't need expensive chisels. You just need to make sure they are absolutely sharp. You don't absolutely have to have a marking knife like these Japanese ones I have there. You could use like an X-Acto knife, but they just get dull really, really fast. So for like 20 bucks, get yourself a good Japanese style marking knife and you won't regret it. Some of you will probably ask, do I really need 2 bow ties here? Why isn't one good enough to hold this crack? And honestly, I don't even know that I need 1 bow tie here. This was kind of a big black void with all that epoxy there. So this is more of something just to break it up aesthetically and make it look a little bit cleaner. If you haven't watched one of my videos before, or more importantly, if you haven't commented in one of my videos before, you might be surprised to know that I actually respond to pretty much every single question or comment you guys leave below, because I know it's frustrating if somebody rushes a certain part or isn't clear, and to be left not knowing if you need to do a certain part on your project. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the comment section below. And the only thing I ask is, if you like this video, please subscribe for more just like it, because it really enables me to keep producing content like this. As far as the actual inlay process, it does take a little bit of practice, but the most important thing is get a good sharp outline of your bow tie or whatever you're going to inlay with your marking knife or X-Acto knife, and then just really slowly take tiny bits off with your chisel till you get up to that line. And eventually you're going to set your chisel right in that line you made with your marking knife, and that's going to give you that perfectly tight, perfectly sharp fit with your bow tie in the end. If you try to take too much wood off at any given pass with your chisel, what you can actually do is compress the wood fibers, and that's going to leave a gap and a poor fit and be kind of ugly when you inlay your bow tie. So what they say to do is to take half of the wood off again and again and again until you can no longer get your chisel anywhere but right in that groove, and then make your final pass with it right in that marking knife groove. After you get your bow tie negatives cut, it's a good idea to go and cut some reliefs on the back side of your bow tie. And I'm doing this with a chisel here. You could also use like a spindle sander, or even be careful with a belt sander. And this is giving the glue somewhere to go. And it's also going to help line it up and go in a little bit easier. So just cutting a slight chamfer. Doesn't have to be anything too exact, just enough of a gap for the glue to go somewhere. I mentioned using epoxy for those splines, and I specifically don't recommend using epoxy for bow ties, and I've used it before, and what it does is it leaves a distinct dark outline around your piece no matter what you do. So use wood glue. I like this Titebond 3. I'll include a link to this in the description below, but do not use epoxy for your bow ties. It just leaves a really ugly dark line around them. You do need to be a little bit careful when you decide to go for the inlay here, because once it goes in, it's probably not going to come out. So that's why you see me using this piece of softwood here to help pound it in a little bit more evenly. And a tip that I do, and it's not something I invented by any means, is adding this walnut dust. And the one thing I do a little bit unique is I'll mix in a little bit of maple dust, and that's just to give it a little bit of a breakup so you don't have the same dark walnut dust outline around your piece. You'd have a little bit of a natural variation like you would normally in the wood with that lighter dust. You always want your bow ties to be slightly proud, and that's because it's a lot easier to take 1/8 of an inch off of a bow tie than it is to take 1 millimeter off of your entire table. So this is what I ended up with in the end, and overall I was pretty pleased with myself. Not really any visible gaps, so overall not too bad. And since this table was for charity, we had some really cool collaborators. And one of those collaborators was Flowy Line Design, who donated his wishbone legs, which I love that style. And I was going to just mount them straight onto the slab, but then I thought it'd be a little bit cleaner if we went ahead and recessed them in there so that top plate doesn't show. And I'll have a video out in the next couple weeks on how to mount your legs similar to this. It's a pretty easy shop-built jig. The most important thing to note if you're going to recess your legs into your tabletop is that don't try to get them perfectly tight in there. What you want is that wood to have room to expand and contract seasonally around it. That's why you see about a 1/4 inch gap all the way around the perimeter of this table base. Another collaborator we had was Canadian Woodworks, and they really generously donated their steel C-channels. And I actually do have a video on how to inlay these so they're perfectly flush with the bottom of your table. So really quick, I'm just using the 1/4 inch bit to cut the slots, coming back with this 1/2 inch bit to cut the recess for the top, and that's going to allow that steel bar to sit down there flush. The only thing you have to do by hand is kind of round over this edge a little bit to allow that radius of the C-channel to sit down there perfectly flush like that. And since my jig didn't go all the way to the edge, I will have to hand cut this square edge just to clean it up a little bit, and gave me a good excuse to break out the nice Japanese chisel here. I know I said earlier that you don't need nice expensive chisels to get a really good cut. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't have nice expensive chisels. And this is probably my nicest one. This is a handmade Damascus Japanese chisel. So it is fun to use, but no, you don't really have to have that to cut straight lines. After I got all my C-channels cut and the legs recessed, I was ready to move on to sanding. And sanding is probably not the most fun thing to do, but it is maybe the most important step in this. And I have a blog post where I go through all of my sanding process, including all the grits that I use the whole way through. And it takes a long time, but this is what's really going to separate the mediocre tables from the truly beautiful tables. And if you can't tell, I am sparing you having to watch me sand each side at every grit. I did sand the underside to 150 grit, which is not quite as high as I'm going to sand the top to. So it is okay to go a little bit lower on your underside than you do on the top, because I get that question a fair amount. But really just going through painstakingly, making sure I get every imperfection filled. This is some CA glue with an activator that I'm filling some tiny little gaps in those epoxy cracks that I filled. It cures in just a few seconds, so I'm able to fill a ton of little imperfections pretty quick, although I do spend quite a bit of time, as you can see here, filling and filling and filling and sanding and filling, but it will give a really nice look in the end. And a little tip I'll give you is what I do is I sand my tables up to 150 grit with my finish sander here, use my Festool sander. And then after 150 grit, I go through and I'll bring out my trim router. And what I keep in this is an 1/8 inch roundover bit. So I never have to adjust the height. It's always set perfectly. Hit it with the 1/8 inch roundover bit. Then I'll come back, do my hand sanding with my handy sanding glove that I made there. And that way it's gonna make the edge much nicer than if you sand it all the way up and then have to go back and then hand sand these corners, because your hand sanding is going to leave these kind of ugly scratches where your orbital sander is going to leave pretty much a perfect finish. So if you can sand it up to 240 with your hand and then come back, sand the entire top up from 150, you're going to get a much nicer finish than if you were to try to hand sand it after getting all the way up to your final sanding grit in the end. I mentioned earlier that I offer a free finishing workshop, and part of the reason why I offer that is because I had such a struggle early on in my woodworking career learning how to get a really nice finish, and this table was a perfect example of just how bad things can get, because I won't even say the finish that I'm using here because I don't want it to seem like I'm attacking any woodworkers if they happen to still use this finish, but it was a complete disaster, and basically every piece of furniture that I used this finish on, I ended up having to refinish. I had to go back into customers' homes. I had to redo absolutely every piece of furniture with this particular finish. And this one, it sat up at Gobi for a couple of weeks, and they'd called me. They're like, hey man, this doesn't look great. And luckily I'd got it before it went out to the customer, but it had turned into like a weird pasty, waxy film on it. So I sanded everything off. I applied Rubio Monocoat, which by the way, Rubio has never sponsored anything I've done. The guy that makes this finish that I'm replacing, he got really upset and spread all kind of weird and misinformation about me, but I don't have any hard feelings towards him. I just can't use this finish anymore. So highly recommend not using whatever this finish was, but Rubio Monocoat works good. I also use Vesting LED oil now. Both those work really, really well. And now I can move on to the table mounting and the C-channel mounting. Most of my videos now are kind of longer feature table builds or some other form of furniture build, but back when I was making this video, I had the freedom to make any type of video I wanted, and so I made a video just on mounting the table base. I also have a video just on mounting the C-channels, and if that's something you're interested in, I'll try to put a link in the video description. And now I'm mounting the threaded inserts. I always like threaded inserts versus screws. I know there's all kinds of tests on YouTube that show whether screws or threaded inserts are stronger, but I just like kind of the professional aspect of using threaded inserts because there's something a little bit smoother about just having that nice machine thread going in. You can assemble it and disassemble it as many times as you want. Also for the C-channels, you want that C-channel to be able to move seasonally or let the wood move around the channel, and you can just kind of barely snug them up. And I just feel like is a little bit more of a professional touch than using just lag bolts or something like that. I would like to know though, if anybody is still awake 2.5 hours into this video, should I get back to doing some of these more niche woodworking how-to videos? Because I really enjoyed making those. I think they're pretty useful, and that table-based mounting video actually got like 2 million views, which is good by, I feel like, about anybody's standards. And it's actually the reason why I started this second channel, Blacktail Studio Uncut. And so if I want to, I can make a video like that. And I actually have a bunch of kind of smaller builds coming out on Blacktail Studio Uncut because I just love the freedom that I have and not have to make some giant table, whereas I can just make kind of a fun little end table or make a compilation like this and not have to worry about the views. Just try to make it for the people that actually want to watch the content and not, quote, try to chase the algorithm. I mentioned earlier that I was building this table to auction it off for a food relief fundraiser, and that has long since passed. You can no longer enter to win this, but if you're curious, we ended up raising over $30,000 for food relief, and I was thrilled with that number. The food bank was absolutely thrilled with that number, and it's not uncommon for me to get a comment from someone that says something like, I can't believe you sold that table for $20,000 when there's people starving on the streets. And it is always nice to be able to say, well, we raised $30,000. What have you done? But that is just me getting a little salty with the comment section. And I do think it was a really worthwhile cause. And I have done several other fundraisers since then. Just the other day, wrote a check for $8,000 for a Make-A-Wish donation we did. We had 2 end tables that were auctioned off. 100% of that went to Make-A-Wish. We've done another Make-A-Wish fundraiser in the past. So all kinds of things in the works. And this one was a remarkable piece, and I was thrilled with how much we were able to raise. If you happen to make it this far in the video, I really hope you enjoyed the second anthology or mega compilation that I've made. This one dedicated entirely to all the different wood species that I've worked with. And to recap, We have the redwood slab. We have the myrtle wood desk. We have the spalted maple end table. We have the Mappa desk. Remember, Mappa, not maple. We have the elm desk. And we also have the Bastogne and the Claro walnut. And every week I like to give a little credit to people who make it all the way to the end of the video. So if you've made it this far, start your question or comment with your favorite of the wood species. And I'll know you made it all the way to the end of this mega compilation. And I'll do my very best to answer your questions and comments first. Thank you so much. Have a great week.